All right. Hello, folks. I believe I am now live. Gonna start this going in just 1 second. How's everyone doing? Do I sound okay? Cool. Okay, let's do this. So, 9/11 is today, and for the benefit of those who don't remember, or just a little bit of refresher, let's think about what 9/11 was all about. So, some folks like to go back to the Crusades and stuff to talk about the history of 9/11. I don't particularly think you have to go back that far. I think that you could talk about the 1950s and the U.S. overthrow of a democratically elected president in Iran and another one in Iraq, and the U.S. funding of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which I discussed in the video on Communism Always Failing that I did on Non-Compete's channel. The Afghanistan one, I think, stands out most specifically because you have the U.S., I think John Kerry was the one that said this, the U.S. was funding the Mujahideen like 6 months prior to the Soviet invasion, and in total giving them like $3 billion in weapons and aid, and the Afghan government is, becoming destabilized with religious fundamentalists within their country getting armed, and the Soviets are asked by the Afghan government to come in. They say no. Eventually the Soviets do go in, and a giant war happens, and then the U.S. is like, hey, thanks for being collateral damage for a proxy war for the Cold War. And the Afghan people were like, hey, we totally fought this war. You want to help us out and stuff? And the U.S. said no, and that's called the Great Betrayal. And then you have like the Gulf War and stuff like that. But then this thing happens in the 90s where a group of folks, or let's wind this back. Yeah, okay, so in the 90s, Cold War is over. There is no motivating principle for U.S. foreign policy. They'd like to try and get U.S. foreign policy organized around global terrorism. So in the 80s and stuff, you have blaming every terrorist incident on Gaddafi in Libya, for example. Reagan did that. In the 90s, you have a group bringing a van full of explosives to the basement of the World Trade Center and trying to blow it up. Doesn't work. And then you have the World Trade Center attacks and all of the war on the war against terrorism, abbreviated TWAT, as Jello Biafra says. And the rest, as they say, is history. So I think what I would like to do now is watch a couple of lectures. I got a playlist together here, which I'll probably make public after this stream. I got a couple of lectures here that we could just enjoy together. The first one being Ward Churchill's lecture on pacifism as pathology, but this lecture scheduled before 9/11, I believe, then takes place after 9/11, and so the focal point really becomes about 9/11. So let's check it out. Let me know if my volume's good also.
I bring you greeting from the Kituwa Band of Cherokees, my people, Colorado chapter of the American Indian Movement, of which I'm a part. from Guartilas, otherwise known as Leonard Peltier, who tonight as I speak to you sits in a cage to federal prison Leavenworth, Kansas. Not for anything, anyone, including even his prosecutor at any point in the last 15 years, perhaps more, has been prepared to say they actually believe
Volume
he
is
did.
good? Perfect.
But rather as a symbol of the arbitrary ability of the federal government of the United States to repress the legitimate aspirations to liberation of indigenous peoples within its claimed boundaries, right here in the good old USA.
So those who've seen
Having
Ward
said
Churchill
that,
debates,
I'd
he
also
always
like
starts
to
with this
say
kind of a thing.
that I'm speaking for none of them tonight. I'm speaking as Ward Churchill, not as AIM, not as Cherokee, not as spokesperson for Leonard Peltier, but just as a human being to human beings, straight up and to the issue. The event was billed Pacifism as Pathology, which is the title of a book that I did in collaboration with Ed Mead and Mike Ryan. Now, I'm assuming that there's a good number of people in here who have already read the book. And I'm also aware that those of you who have not certainly can.
Ward Churchill's style of talking is a little complex, but I could speed it up to 1.25 if folks would like that. Let me know in the chat.
You can tell it's not a terribly large book, and so it's not a terribly long read. I therefore do not propose to recapitulate what it is verbatim. It's in the book.
I did a review of Pacifism as Pathology, by the way.
And there have been some events that have occurred since we originally planned this particular event. They occurred in September, on the 11th, as a matter of fact, which changes the context of a lot of what I might have said in any event. I'm going to just go full bore in that particular direction, engage in a little challenge. What I want to do is basically line out an argument here as rapidly as possible and turn it into exchange. Comments, which do not extend to speeches. Okay, Q&A, spitwads, brickbats, whatever nonviolent things might be coming my way as a result of what it is that I might say. See where we end up. So that's the general drill that's on hand. What is it that the citizenry of the United States and even its most progressive formations has engaged by way of applying even a break, much less bringing to a halt this pattern of wholesale criminality engaged in by its governor? And it's not simply this abstraction of criminal behavior or comportment. It's not simply a posture. It's not something that we sit there and say, well, that is wrong in some abstract moral sense. No, the nature of the criminality in which the United States engages, as Noam Chomsky and many others have copiously documented, translates into piles and piles and piles of rotting, stinking corpses all over the planet, everywhere but here.
So this is kind of a little bit of a third worldist argument that he's making, but I do agree with it that when we're looking at the death and the starvation and all the terrible things that are taking place in the third world, and then us in the U.S., our response is to, I don't know, buy organic and show up at a protest with a little cardboard sign and then, you know, leave when we're asked to. It seems contrary to our goals to engage in the discourse in that way, is his argument.
Yeah, these are real people. This is a real grinding mystery. This is real burning flesh. This is real shredded babies, and not just a few. We're talking now on a scale of millions and perpetually. That's the direct commission, and the indirect commission of the same kind of crime, which is made possible by the direct commission, is death by starvation, death by deprivation of medical attention, death by all manner of means, truncations of lifespan, people with 40-year longevity as an entire population, that degree of intensive impoverishment for the raking off, exploitation, whatever you want to call it, of the assets which should make their lives livable. That's the nature of the process, the structure of the reality, and what has been the response.
Is that increasing the volume? I turned it up on my laptop.
We have petition campaigns. We have marches. We have rallies. We read a lot of books, and some of us scribble quite a lot and publish more. Make sure the word is out there. Defy logic by announcing that we're speaking truth to power, as if power didn't know what it was doing somehow.
I like that line a lot, and I've used it. I'm going to turn up the volume, I guess, is what people are saying. Maybe right here. I've used that line a lot about speaking truth to power as if power didn't know what it's doing. Yeah, he critiques this idea that we just scribble into books. And I think that I feel that way about making videos sometimes, that I wonder the effectiveness of my action, or if I'm just making videos, getting the truth out there, and how effective that is.
We might wish to consider perhaps speaking to people once in a while, but to what purpose? Well, apparently so diets can be changed. Okay, we can have more bicycle paths. We can have no smoking signs at every flat surface in California. We can bear moral witness and feel better about ourselves because we're enlightened and aware when we go home from the rally, which did absolutely nothing to change anything tangible in terms of the functioning of power. Has to go to a particular end. But what I'm going to say here is that once that cycle has been completed, and it's been completed 3 times in my adult life. Hey, the style show out there for the alternative or counterculture or whatever, they're clear back to tie-dye at this point. My God. Those went out when I was in college. And now it's back in elephant bells. Next thing you know, people are going to be, well, never mind. It's become a ritual form where once the list of finite options of the sort that I just talked about are exhausted, producing effect of utter ineffectuality, we'll go back to the beginning and start it all over again. And when that fails, we go back, and there's been iteration after iteration after iteration after iteration of that throughout the 20th century on the part of the so-called radical opposition, progressive opposition, liberal opposition, almost all of it coming under a rubric of something called nonviolence. Now, before I get all off into the nature of my critique of this and start making comparisons to Merlin the magician and reliance upon alchemy, that if we repeat the same failed experiment long enough, over and over again, eventually that lead will become gold.
Aaron from Reeducation and I recently did that review of how nonviolence protects the state. Similar stance being labeled here.
On the cover of the book. It's a 2-letter word. I'm not even going to be obscene here. As. It doesn't say pacifism is pathology. It says pacifism as pathology. And I think it's a fairly important distinction to make. There's nothing in pacifism.
Yeah, Green Element. I used to listen to lectures like crazy when I did free. I download all these lectures by Michael Albert and Michael Parenti and Ward Churchill and Derek Jensen and such.
I'm aware of that will withstand scrutiny and is worthy of the name holds that one shall not inflict violence. It says nothing about one will not absorb it. It says nothing about pacifism is synonymous with avoidance of risk. It says nothing about pacifism is synonymous with avoidance of sacrifice, struggle. There have been pacifists in the tradition of opposition in the United States ever since I was old enough to be aware of it. There was a guy by the name of Norman Morrison who was a practicing Quaker, clear back in 1965 when I was still in high school, went down to the Pentagon to protest what they were setting out to do in Vietnam, introducing maneuver battalions at Da Nang. Poured a can of gasoline over his head, struck a match. Got attention for about 4 days. Now, I absolutely disagree with suicide as a political tactic in almost any instance you can name. I think Norman Morrison was a person with enough talent, enough commitment that he could have had an impact if he had extended his life, but he made that choice. I can disagree with the politic of it. I can disagree with the tactic, but the one thing I cannot do is suggest that Norman Morrison avoided risk.
Yes, I can pause it when I make comments.
That Norman Morrison avoided sacrifice. That Norman Morrison did not have the courage of his convictions. He most certainly did. And there are others and less extreme, although several examples of that sort from the Vietnam period I could pull up. But at a level of struggle and sacrifice in nonviolent terms, you'd have to look at the Berrigans who courted imprisonment. Absolute defiance, didn't stay safe for a moment. And again, I can run down other examples. I can run them down all night if you want. People I've worked with, people I know about. In terms of people I work with, Shara Griffith from Greenpeace, who established a peace camp that physically interposed that group of people between federal marshals and my own group at Yellow Thunder Camp occupation in the early 1980s. And there was substantial risk involved in that because those guys were coming, and what they had in mind to do was something like Waco. And it worked. Had it just been the Indians, and had it just been the armed struggle, we had had a bloodbath or one sort or another, probably wouldn't have worked out like Waco because we were better prepared for what it was that was coming, apparently, than the people who were there. We were not housed in a structure that was subject to being torched and everybody inside burned alive. So it would have played out a little bit different, but by virtue of the fact of a bunch of little white kids, and that's really what it came down to in the minds of the marshal, we're not going to drive an armored personnel carrier over the top of a bunch of kids who've got well-connected, affluent parents who might just get us in a bunch of trouble. So it worked. It worked on the basis of incurring the risk. But that's not how it usually works. It's not how it usually works. It works by way of a certain sort of collaboration with the functioning of power. Because it's well understood that there are certain lines of activity which are not only condoned by the elites, but are considered necessary to demonstrate that this is a functioning democracy. All evidence to the contrary notwithstanding. Things having to do with the expression of political speech, so long as you do it in a way that's proved, except it doesn't actually disrupt anything. If you won't do it, they'll come down and ask you to organize it and offer you a grant for the purpose.
So this is discussed in How Nonviolence Protects the State as well, that... Oops. That a lot of times pacifism and protests and stuff can act as a safety valve. You know, Aaron discussed in his part on the review of How Nonviolence Protects the State that we live in this wonderful government that will allow people to protest right in front of a military base without too much commotion, but that protest happens to not change anything structurally. So what does that mean for our effectiveness?
And that reality goes into the definition of the movement of what actually constitutes violence, if you think about it. Consider Seattle. Y'all aware of Seattle, the WTO demonstrations that occurred there? Are you aware that the big to-do among the so-called nonviolent folk was that there were a bunch of youngsters running around wearing black masks and such, called themselves, I think, the Black Bloc. Anybody ever heard of them? The Black Bloc was being horribly violent. They were breaking the windows in Starbucks coffee houses. Yeah. And so pristine and pure were the advocates of nonviolence in the face of this that people who could never in their wildest imaginings lift a hand to prevent a police officer from doing a damn thing linked arms, supplanted the cops, and manhandled the black blockers away from the windows protecting the corporate property. True story. True story. It's on videotape. Battle of Seattle. Get out and look at these brave guys defending Starbucks from the violence of a broken window when they were ostensibly there to protest a corporate ravage of the third world that was translating into hundreds of thousands and even millions of deaths. And if you can't see the contradiction in that, you're not looking. At two levels. One, the idea that a personal posture can be assumed that precludes the violence of the context. The context is violent, that's why you're there. So it's by no means, no matter what you do, going to be a nonviolent context. Get used to it. What I'm talking about in the third world is going to go on every minute of every protest. They're supposedly the reasons for the protests. And the cops are wearing those guns in their hips and carrying that chemical mace and that pepper gas, that spray, and those other accoutrements of repression for a reason. You don't make them nonviolent by acquiescing. The violence is systemic and it remains there. Your acquiescence simply perpetuates it. That's at the philosophical level. And at the practical level, the idea that somebody who would not oppose a police officer in the process of beating someone half to death with a riot baton could then manhandle a black blocker away from a window kind of speaks for itself. That contradiction has already been remarked. But then the upshot comes on the websites of the movement to do in the aftermath of Seattle. I have one in particular, I won't name the name of the individual, and I doubt that it was a real name that was posted with it anyway, thanking the Black Bloc a lot, sarcasm dripping. Thanks a lot, guys, for turning Seattle into a fascist state for the duration of your visit here. So let's see, these guys got off the buses from Eugene or wherever it was they were from, okay? And all of a sudden, the police chief and the mayor, both exhibiting visible shock, horrified that these guys were here, and knowing they had to take drastic measures to prevent the breaking of Starbucks windows, ran out and bought themselves a SWAT team, a couple armored personnel carriers, a whole inventory of tear gas, got everybody trained and equipped and coordinated to get it out there in the street. That all happened in about 28 minutes, and then, comes around somehow or another to the idea, this good old American idea, it's kind of like when H. Rap Brown made reference to violence being American as a cherry pie, So is the notion of blaming the victim. Victims of fascism somehow or another become responsible for the fact of the fascism itself. Damn Jews. Hadn't been for them, Nazis wouldn't have exterminated them all.
So I think this has like two sharp parallels for us these days. One is you have the Some More News guy just did a video today about the reporter who's complaining that someone said he was like a bed bug, and yet he complains about the snowflake progressives of these days, and people like Steven Crowder decrying censorship, and yet they're getting like funded by billionaires and have no problem maintaining their status on the platform even if they are demonetized. And as Churchill said, you see this within protests itself. So the protests are supposed to be, you're protesting some violence that is going to be taking place, whether it's the Women's March or if it's an anti-war march or something. And so you're addressing this violence, and yet we seem to blame the victim, that the burning garbage can or something becomes the ultimate act of violence, when the violence that act is challenging, you know, obviously in the corporate media and whatever, goes completely unnoticed, unmentioned.
Yeah. Maybe you can find a logical defensibility to such propositions, but I can't. Colin Powell, and actually I saw him make this comment on CNN, which I'm a junkie, I get all kinds of good sound bites out of that thing. Yeah, Colin's standing there saying, as a joke, you know, I'm running out of enemies. I just can't find any more enemies for us to go after. This about, I don't know, a year ago. You know, as a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, one of the orchestrators of the My Lai Massacre cover-up, which is what propelled his career, and present Secretary of State presiding over a Holocaust out there in the Third World. This was his idea of coming forth with a little levity. But they're quoting him like this is serious. Like the brass is really running out of targets and demons. And then they come up with an example. Bush's Star War package is going forward to Congress, where it could have been expected to meet stiff resistance, meaning they were going to talk about it a lot. And it was going to pass anyway. They actually say this. And clearly it wouldn't. You know, the preponderance of it would have been in the end passed anyway. But all of that's over now because of September 11th. I read it, I swear, 3 times, trying to find out what it was that was over. Those people out there who are literally sitting in hovels, starving to death, watching their children die of malnutrition and exposure, in the masses, are supposed to be, apparently, thrilled that we've actually gotten to the point in this country, through no doubt our enlightened pressure by nonviolent tactics, to where we can actually stimulate a debate about something that's going to pass anyway in the Congress. And if they should wait contentedly, dying the entire time in absolute misery, while we dither our way through to the point where we can find a pill that we can take that will provide us a painless solution while preserving privilege. Ooh. But if someone has a better means of explaining what is the expectation is that's being pushed off on these people, I would really like, in the aftermath of what it is that I'm saying here, to hear about it. I'm subject to re-articulation every once in a while. Someone can give me a better idea, but I haven't come up with a better explanation of what the expectation implicit in that remark might have been. What is it? It was over now.
So his main complaint here is that when we do things like protest a war or something, what we're protesting is incredibly violent and destructive, and our solution is to go and do the protest and leave when we're asked to. You know, in what way, what are we demanding of the people that we're supposedly doing the protest for? Like, what are we're asking them to... I'm reminded of like the meme I saw where it's a drone flying, dropping a bomb, and one of the people being bombed says, oh, this is a female president dropped these bombs. How progressive. You know, what is it that we're asking the people that we're supposedly, you know, when it's fighting global warming or fighting inequality or fighting war, what is it we're asking these people to put up with in the face of a protest's ineffectiveness? I mean, the saying goes that the state decides the means of the protest, you know, by having, let's say, something like the Occupy Wall Street movement, by having that movement be, in a lot of ways, ineffective. The state is saying that mode of protest doesn't work. You know, if they would have listened to that, then the conversation ends there and progress is made. But the state didn't do that. The state came in and clubbed everyone, you know, no student loan forgiveness, no housing debt forgiveness or anything like that. Just come in and club everyone. That's the state saying this form of protest will not work. You need to do something different. Let's keep going.
What we have now is a clarification. And the clarification is that if you're serious about actually affecting change, and you're serious about the idea that international law should be binding, and you're serious about the conception that killing masses of other people and starving their babies to death, as 500,000 Iraqi children have been starved to death in non-wartime conditions over the past 10 years without a murmur of protest worthy of the name in this country, then you're going to have to understand that in a relative position of disempowerment, such as we are, there's no way that what we call a movement or the opposition or anything else can actually go toe-to-toe with the federal government and compel it to do anything at this point, relatively disempowered in an extreme form as we are now, we do not foreclose any tactical options available to us. None. That's insane and absurd, particularly on the basis of making it a morally superior argument to do so. As to the moral superiority of bearing moral witnesses, while babies die, decade in, decade out, I can find no morality whatsoever, but I can find self-interest, I can find self-indulgence, and I find it disgusting in extreme degree to have that peddled as a morally superior position to people who, in the face of being on the receiving end of that, try to find some means of attracting attention or at least strike back. At least strike back. The old thing about if I'm going to die, which we all will, I would much rather do so on my feet than on my knees, kind of binding here. At least those who respond in kind to the rules imposed have the dignity of dying on their own terms, rather than those that are imposed by a system, and frankly the people in the system who do not consider them as valuable as the toilet paper upon which they wipe their ass. We do not foreclose on any tactical options available to us. We do not have a moral prerogative to foreclose as a moral principle any tactical option available to us in the face of what it is that's actually going on out there, if not here. But you can find it here as well. What it is happening in the third world happens in every barrio, every migrant camp, every inner city, every Indian reservation in this country. And it doesn't just restrict itself to communities of color. You can find it in Appalachia as well. It's
the phrasing, his phrasing is very particular to his speaking style. The way of saying this same argument that I like better was posed by the author Derek Jensen, who has his own problems and baggage, but he does make good arguments on various points. And one of his points regarding the environment is that, to what extent will the people of the future care that we were morally pure? To what extent will the people of the future care that we we felt emboldened by our understanding of, Gandhi and Martin Luther King and stuff to engage in a very morally pure activist action when the water is undrinkable and the air is unbreathable? Are they really going to care that we were, that we canceled all the right people, that we had, no one in the movement had ever done a bad thing in the past? We'd canceled all the people we needed to cancel. Moral purity was upheld, and the water became undrinkable and the air became unbreathable in the end.
Both a racial, ethnic issue and a class issue by a structure that consigns people to the dregs of misery just as a concomitant of doing business and wishes to extrapolate itself in predatory fashion in an even more virulent form upon the remainder of the planet. If there were a serious movement, a serious opposition in this country, which could be relied upon to do its level best to affect fundamental change in this country, one could assume that those in the third world who are bearing the brunt of what it is that's happening might be in a position where they could say, we could give it some more time. We give it some more time. But such a movement does not presently exist for the reasons that I've already indicated. We have to ask ourselves now what it would be that would be required to create such a movement. Well, first is a consciousness of what it is that I'm talking about, the non-foreclosure of options. What I'm not doing is making an argument here that everybody should run out and get yourself some Molotov cocktails, get yourself a piece, snipe at the cops, do all those silly things that they are always accusing us of being about doing when we make these kinds of articulations.
Isn't there a movie in the works right now about Antifa where it's like guns are banned, but the Antifa has guns, and it's supposed to be this modern day Red Dawn movie? Maybe someone in the chat could post what the heck that movie's called, but they really seem to or it's like that book. What was that book? No Trigger Warning or something, about the college that's Red Dawn style taken over by the armed progressives. Okay.
No, I am saying get yourself intellectually, psychologically prepared. Get yourself equipped, get yourself trained, have available the option to engage in a reflexive and flexible manner to whatever the situation is that presents itself, so that you can engage in a reasonable and rational analysis of what it is that might work in any given instance. I believe in armed struggle. I have engaged in armed struggle over the last 20 years on repeated occasions. With that belief in hand, with that experience in hand, my own praxis, probably 95% of it has been of the nature of what would be called nonviolent. I've engaged in petition campaigns. I engage in marches. I engage in protests of various sorts. I engage in boycotts. I engage in all those lines of activity, and I do not restrict myself to that. Thank you very much. In fact, my refusal to restrict myself to that, and that of other people with whom I work, their refusal in common with my own, often adds a measure of credibility to the other modes of protest that would otherwise be absent. And I'm not telling people who have moral compunctions against engaging in armed struggle that they need to violate those compunctions, but what you have to do is manifest solidarity rather than condemnation and repudiation for those who don't share those principles. We must operate on a basis of mutual respect.
Derek Jensen again had made a similar argument, saying that that most of his protest, his political action has been nonviolent, but that he doesn't restrict himself to that, purely, and that if we want to be effective in a sort of no canceling, good and proper allies kind of way, then we have a responsibility to not call the police, to not engage in sort of counter-revolutionary action against someone who's engaging in something that we might not ourselves engage in. I mean, the review I have coming out on Friday of Post-Scarcity Anarchism, I discuss Black Lives Matter, and there's that event where the Black Lives Matter protesters were like yelling at white students trying to study in the library or whatever, and it got all this negative press. I mean, I'm not about to go and cancel those people because they'd done a bad. They're still fighting for what I would consider the correct side. I just maybe I don't fully go along with what they did, but I'm not about to call the police on them or join up with Fox News and say, well, these wave a judgmental finger at them. I'm not going to do that either.
For most people, the question of violence and nonviolence, however, is not a matter of principle. Primarily, the question of nonviolence as opposed to violence is a tactical consideration, the question of what works. What works in any given situation? What is most likely to work? For which investment can you get the most return in capitalist terms? That's a language they understand. The other language is a language they understand as well. They've ultimately exempted themselves as they convinced the body politic that it had a right to exempt itself from receiving what it is that is dished out by the system. That was what the shock and the ramifications were of 9/11. We need to do a little more careful assessment of what it is that was about. I might not agree that it was the most effective tactic that could have been undertaken at that particular point, but I frankly, for the life of me, can't figure out another, much less a better one, people in Afghanistan or Iraq could have engaged. It's not exactly like they have a military parity with the United States. There's 1.5 million dead in Iraq and there's 1 million dead in Afghanistan. How much longer were they supposed to be non-responsive?
The millions that he's referring to there, if you folks aren't aware, is that the U.S. imposed sanctions in Iraq after the Gulf War, barring food and medicine from going into the country, which I believe is in violation of international law, or at least when we were barring medicines from going into Cuba, it was considered a violation of international law. So I don't see why the same wouldn't apply here. It led to, like, some estimates say 2 million, some say 1.5 million dead. And when Madeleine Albright was asked, do you feel like this was justified, that we engaged in this activity that led to millions dying? And I don't want to do this. Pick a time. This is annoying. Stop doing this. Okay. Hopefully that's done away with.
I've had people debate this with me. Brian Wilson, another whose courage cannot be questioned, chained himself to a railroad track in front of an ordnance depot to stop a flow of arms that was going to the Contra War, as I recall, was run over by the locomotive, got right back up and said the same thing he said before. He tells me his method would be to starve the institutional structure, deny it the transfusions of cash it requires, vampire-like, in order to exist. On 9/11, 19 guys equipped with $30 worth of box cutters did 100 billion, and the count is increasing, dollars worth of damage structurally to the economy of the United States. That was my initial estimate of how much that was going to ripple out to cost. I think I was low. In other words, 19 guys with $30 worth of box cutters did more bleeding of the system in terms of value that it understands than every boycott and every march and every campaign that we've undertaken since Vietnam. And they did it in about 20 minutes.
Whew. Okay, so this one's a tough one. I used to be really all about this argument, this sentiment here that, 12 guys, $30 worth of box cutters in 20 minutes did more structural damage to the sort of military corporate industrial complex than any of this peaceful protest stuff had done. My biggest disagreement with that stance being that you have to wonder the motivations behind the action. I think that, with the motivations being retaliatory, I think that there's that part is understandable as I'm forgetting his name, the Twitch streamer that recently said, America deserved 9/11. I think that you can look at that and say, yeah, with the actions the U.S. engaged in the Middle East, it's not at all surprising that something like 9/11 took place. However, if you take somebody like if a neo-Nazi group were to stop a shipment of arms to Israel and were to destroy those weapons, I would agree with that tactic, but I wouldn't agree with the reasons why those tactics were engaged in. I wouldn't agree with the movement that engaged in that tactics. Or we have a lot of talk now about sort of eco-fascist type people who are concerned with global warming, because at this point, how can you deny it? And yet they turn that concern towards, race replacement, and we're going to have all these ecological refugees. And so if they were to engage in something like some sort of environmentalist tactic, that I would agree with the tactic, with the action and the outcome of the tactic. I would disagree with the framing of why that action took place, and I would disagree with the group who engaged in the tactic. If that makes sense. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So, still, spicy take from Ward Churchill. And this is what got him on Fox News, by the way, making these kind of statements. He wrote a book shortly after called On the Justice of Roosting Chickens, about the U.S. sort of deserving 9/11 and stuff, which got him pretty popular.
Now, you do your own calculus on this and figure out whether or not, irrespective of whether they had other options available, it was an effective tactic. In their terms, it had to be. And understand, they are not occupying the privileged positions that we occupy, and understand as well, even to make a decision as to what fashion you're going to represent yourself with in public spaces, or whether or not you're going to change your dialect or privileges. People who are in starvation conditions don't have the option of making determinations what the proper diet might be, whether I'm going to be a macrobiotic, a vegetarian, whether I'm going to subsist entirely on meat or just rice. No, we don't get these choices. See, this is a privileged lot. We're all privileged, every one of us. And the non-privileged make certain choices according to sets of understandings and imperatives that we don't happen to necessarily share. And we got to get used to that too, on the basis of that exercise of mutual respect, try to understand where it is they're coming from. In the process, we might just learn something in a less abstract way that we've intended to assimilate thus far. You understand? Actually, at that point, other than to make the observation, the people who wanted to make the argument that the other route, that route of repeating the same failed experiments over and over again on the basis of some presumption of personal moral purity, and that they are in fact being more effective in the long run than people who take direct action of the sorts that occurred in 9/11, and I'm not suggesting that need to be repeated, are functioning in the level of absolute duplicity is one possibility, or to cut them more slack, I suppose, on the basis of a delusional self-awareness. Delusional in terms of self, which then precipitates a delusional understanding of the reality they inhabit and engage. And to be delusional is to be curable, but it is not to be in a position of making a determination of the tactical responses appropriate to people who are not. Thank you. With that all said, I think the position that I wanted to take has been pretty well lined out. And with you thus stimulated to reply in kind or in contrary fashion, I think I'll stop impersonating a talking head up here, step back, take a drink of water, and let's get to it. Thank you very much for listening.
I'm wondering, it seems like we could come up with better examples of a non-pacifistic nature than September 11th. Like, it seems like there's so much that can be done in terms of effectively attacking the system that wouldn't entail suicide, that wouldn't entail murdering, like well, there's lots of simple little tactics that can be easily repeated to cause probably as much damage with less risk, and less sacrifice, more joy. I don't want to be singling out the actions of 11 as like the exemplary act.
So for those who missed the question, it sounds a little fuzzy there, but basically the question was arguing that the 9/11 attack shouldn't be held up as this this great strike against the U.S. military-industrial complex when there's other activity you can engage in. I think that a video I did with American Johnson on doing little hijinks like black faxing and stuff like that is an example of a little tactic that you could do that doesn't endanger life. But let's see what Ward Churchill has to say about this.
Okay, that's what you think, and you sort of, in a very ambiguous and vague form, laid out why. But since you said there must be tactics that would blah, 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 name one. Movement's not a tactic. Movement's something you build in some fashion or another. We got movements all over the place. We got alphabet soup in terms of parties to go with the movements. We got all that. The question is what those movements are going to do. That's what tactics are about, and tactics are a fulfillment of a strategy. What's your strategy?
There's all kinds of sabotage actions that are taken by people on a regular basis that maybe don't get quite as much attention, but do cause a fair amount of damage, and people don't necessarily have to get caught, etc., or die in doing it. I guess I'm just pointing out.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
Are you morally outraged and opposed to the hanging of Adolf Eichmann by the state of Israel for his commanding participation in the Holocaust?
I don't really see how that's relevant, no.
Well, I'll explain how it's relevant. Just tell me how you feel about it. I think there's somebody else answering for this guy now. I do believe in collectivity, but let the man speak for himself. Okay, unless he's got a tapeworm.
I said I'm not more, but I'm not really. Okay, I said no, I'm not. Whatever.
You're not morally outraged. Okay. Then I suppose I would ask you the question, but that would be getting rhetorical at this point of what's the difference. But what way I'll frame it is how else do you bring all these little Eichmanns who'll be sitting on the upper floors of that building to some kind of justice? Little sabotage act? Yes, I know there were janitors there, and there were a couple kids on those airplanes, and I feel bad about the janitors, and I feel bad about the kids. I don't feel one bit worse about those two kids that were on the aircraft, though, than those 500,000 Iraqi babies who keep getting shuffled back while we talk about the innocents in the World Trade Center. Thus far. And how exactly, you were right at your analysis that had there been a quantitative increase in the magnitude of suffering in the third world kind of escapes me. It may change its pace, it may change its focus, but like water, it's going to seek its own level, and that level's been relatively constant, including during the Vietnam period. It did not go up appreciably because of the armed aggression the United States was engaged in Southeast Asia. What you have to understand is this horror show is a constant out there. And we had an anti-war movement as long as it was an engagement of U.S. troops in Southeast Asia in a direct sense, partly because they're conscripting people and send them over there, but they could end up being casualties. That was a major incentive in having an anti-war movement, but it wasn't the only one. But with the withdrawal of U.S. ground troops, that anti-war movement diminished. In 1975, when the United States was still refusing, as it is today, to pay reparations that it agreed to at Geneva, there was no protest whatsoever. Everybody was supposedly calculating and calibrating their tactics and were motivated by the well-being of the people on the receiving end over in Southeast Asia, but their well-being wasn't even part of the calculus by the time it got to the aftermath of it. It was just eclipsed from consciousness. Such as the incipient anti-war movement during the Gulf War. It was just beginning to get off the ground, and then the war was over and it went away. Well, there have been 500,000 Iraqi children die as a result of the ongoing U.S. intervention in the years since. And you've frankly seen more attention committed to installing additional speed bumps in suburban neighborhoods than to the fate of those children. Well, this can serve the purpose if we stop repudiating and shoving it away like it's something that's horror. Hey, there's a message in this. Let's get the message and let's articulate the message rather than join the cheering section of CNN to explain how it was an unmitigated evil. And I know you didn't use that term, but we get close. I'm seeing all kinds of coverage now of the fate of Afghani women. And I'm not insensitive to the fate of Afghani women. I'm not a cheerleader for the Taliban. But I find it kind of peculiar in progressive circles there's a sudden interest in the fate of Afghani women when there hadn't been. Taliban's been around a while. Unremarked upon until all of a sudden there was a need to rationalize U.S. intervention, and somehow the left is doing its part to make the rationalization stick by saying, well, they were bad people, and look, it's better to lot of the women. Believe that to Ted Koppel and people in the mass media. We don't need to do their work for them, but we are. We are. We need a sharp analysis, a clear analysis. If we're going to build a movement, as was suggested, it needs to be based upon principles of clarity of understanding, among other things, and this isn't going in that direction. Okay. To recapitulate, don't make it any longer, I got to repeat it. Because I'm operating on the assumption, which I've neither tested nor may be testable, that the 19 people alleged to have done what was done on the 11th actually did it. And she sees the interest, primarily, I think you said exclusively, the interest served by what happened were the people that we're up against. Is that about it?
The total the timing was completely, this was supposedly to help the Palestinian people. This was the timing was completely stupid because the tide was finally starting to turn, where even the most knuckleheaded Americans were starting to get a clue that it was more the story.
Knuckleheaded Americans have always been starting to get a clue about everything for as long as I've been alive. It just never translates into anything, okay? But I got to ask you, and I sort of see what you're saying, and you're correct. I am relying on the news media, and that's always a sort of a tenuous proposition. But what are you suggesting, since the beneficiaries of the government of the United States, that they put operatives of their own in these aircraft and flew them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in order to get legitimation from even more draconian, repressive activities against everybody?
It's as logical as the theory that they're proffering, and at the very least, any way you slice it, we're quote-unquote attacked by our own operatives. I'm waiting for Bush to get up and apologize now to the Afghani people for having supported the Taliban in the first place.
On that score, you're probably on firm ground. Okay. I still have to recapitulate what you say, so you can't make it too long and detailed a thing. The thing I just said, which I consider to be absurd when I put it out there, was accepted at face value as saying it make as much sense as any explanation has been put out there, and even assuming it's correct, that it was Al-Qaeda which did this, I think you said Taliban, it's still our own operatives coming back because it created both Taliban and, by extension, Al-Qaeda. And there is definitely a truth to that, although I don't think there was a conspiracy in the federal government to knock down the World Trade Center and fly a plane into the Pentagon, per se. They're trying to spin it to their advantage. Obviously, that is the most predictable thing in the world for them to do.
I don't believe it was a surprise.
We're not going to have a debate. Okay, there's many things they would likely do and are on record as having done by way of provocation and creating the appearance of organization they wish to discredit and engage in certain kinds of activities, but knocking down the World Trade Center is not likely to be on the list of things they do in order to generate a public response of a certain sort.
What he's about to say here, I think, is an important for, the 9/11 truther type crowd thing, and I think it translates into a lot of other stuff as well. You can have, when it comes to like this kind of conspiracy maybe type stuff, whether it's like Sandy Hook and like gun laws, or whether it's the Oklahoma City bombing and that Crime Prevention Act that Clinton or whatever passed like shortly after, or whether it's the September 11th attack and then the policies that the Bush administration engaged in shortly after. People will look at the call and response that took place and say, okay, well, this whole thing must have been planned. And I really don't think that's the case. I don't think it even needs to be the case. I think that bad things are basically kind of happening all the time, and then those who are in the position to do so use that as rationalization for what they were already going to do. So he's going to go on to say in just a second that the people that were in the World Trade Center, a lot of those people had very specialized knowledge and were not easily replaceable people. So it's unlikely that the state apparatus would have made the 9/11 thing happen so that they could go on to do the foreign policy stuff that they kind of were already doing. But they, damn sure will take that action, the 9/11 attack or other attacks. They'd take that opportunity to push through, shock doctrine style. For those who have read Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine or seen my review of it, then they use that as the excuse to engage in the tactics.
For one thing, they took out in virtually its entirety the top international bond trading firm in the world. 700 of those people were top scale bond traders. I mean, it's not simply the material cost of this, it's the technical expertise, and that was the nature of my reference a while ago to Eichmann. These were the technicians to make the New World Order function in economic terms, and they were not going to sacrifice them that gratuitously in order to do something they were already doing in a more open way. So you look at this anti-terrorism package they came down with, and it's draconian, it is harsh. It licenses them to do virtually anything they want to repress political activities of virtually anyone they want. And guess what? They already were, just a question of who you were. It's like the idea that somehow or another the black blockers coming to town made Seattle into a fascist state by way of its police. Depends on which neighborhood in Seattle you lived in. Okay, whether you were that removed from the reality of the police is to not know they were already a fascist state. There's a certain calculus that goes into this, and the nonviolence proponents might pay attention to it. The more the degree that you're considered tangibly threatening to the stable functioning of the state is the more the degree of repression that will be visited upon you. I don't know too many people out there with picket signs and stuff that are visited with very much repression. Decoded, that simply means you're not doing a damn thing to disrupt. the functioning of the state and perhaps even furthering it by creating a false image of how it functions, a liberal image, okay? If you're actually tangibly disrupting anything, you're going to be visited with a kind of repression that they just codified as applicable to everybody.
I think that this is very important to recognize, and I stated this at a in a live stream that PD Morin and some other folks were doing, that you know, if you're not being repressed, then are you being effective? You know, if unfortunately, in a weird way, if BreadTube is allowed to exist, is it being effective by nature of it being allowed to exist? You know, wouldn't it be like, take COINTELPRO or something, for example? So the COINTELPRO activities have engaged, you know, long before the 60s and have been engaged in since. But are we a left at this time, a left that has garnered a COINTELPRO type situation? I don't know. It's hard to say, but you got to wonder if you're not being repressed, are you being effective? It's kind of a scary thing to think about, but it does worry me.
But it was at their discretion. They made a determination who it was that would be targeted with it based upon perceived threat anyway, which meant, theoretically at least, everybody was subject to it to begin with. So what this has done is clarified an existent situation, which is another benefit if it's articulated that way. We can see things a little more clearly now. The lines are being drawn and they're drawing them. And it's not just here. This is global. The United States extends its jurisdiction in this sense globally, and they're saying so straight out, but they've been doing that for a long time anyway, and it's always a matter of confusion and debate. Well, there's nothing to debate. They just put it in black letter legal form. It didn't change the material reality. It changed the surface impression in such a way that we can actually use it to our advantage in terms of explaining the terms of combat here and link it to the terms of combat there in a much more concrete way than it seems to have been done in the past. Well, the point that was made was, this really did turn into a September 11th event, didn't it? Okay. September 11 confused everybody, including the movement. And I would submit that anyone that was confused by September 11th was already so confused that, all right. What we got is a weird kind of American exceptionalism of the left, of the opposition. It's the same thing as it is the right. America's subject to a different set of rules and a different set of standards and a different everything. Those things that happen out there, we can understand them. They're appropriate out there. We understand them and see the appropriateness everywhere but here. You got the Israelis firing artillery to provoke the Palestinians across the border in Lebanon in the early 80s before the invasion of Lebanon by Israel, okay? The first time the Palestinians let it go, so what the Israelis did, they intensified it and fired again. This time they got a response. Now he's talking about how this is played out in the media and all the rest. The one thing he's not doing is telling us an inexcusable terrorist response on the part of the Palestinians. And aside from the fact that what got hit this time was in this country rather than some other country, there's no real difference tangibly between the two examples. That after 10 years of patient waiting for a movement to get itself together and decide it was more important to save the lives of Iraqi children than to remove ashtrays from a restaurant in the Bay Area, they finally took matters in their one hand through some, what they call them, 300,000-pound cruise missiles into about the best target you could possibly have picked at any point in the United States. Okay? And in the process, extracted a toll, primarily composed of the technocrats that I was talking about, not exclusively so. There's going to be what the United States calls some collateral damage on any action that is taken. That's unfortunate, but those are terms that were imposed by the United States. And in that process, extracted a revenge, if you want to look at it that way, of 1% of the Iraqi children alone. I still don't hear.
This is an argument, again, that Derek Jensen made. He referred to the Death Star, saying, like, well, wasn't there daycare and children and stuff on the Death Star, janitors and stuff on the Death Star? Because the U.S. Foreign policy engages in collateral damage, no problem. And in a way, any activity you engage in will involve some sort of collateral damage, whether that's attacking some sort of corporate infrastructure that might lead to unintended consequences. It's a question to have, to be sure.
Anybody talking about the Iraqi children? I hear all kinds of variations on bemoaning the fate of those 5,000 innocent people who were the primary investment bankers and bond traders and so forth in those top rungs. I mean, I've been running through those obituaries in the New York Times, and I found one receiving clerk so far. I'll count you in the EMTs and the firemen, okay? But so far, I've counted well over half of all the casualties at the World Trade Center alone as being in the Eichmann capacity. And I've even had people try to argue that those in the Pentagon were innocent bystanders as well. I mean, my God, if you can't hit the Pentagon, what can you hit? By that standard of logic, it would have been a crime against humanity for the Viet Cong or the NVA to have fired mortar rounds into a U.S. compound because, after all, there were Vietnamese house girls, as they were called, hooch girls, okay, in Papasan who burned to crap. And those were, of course, innocent civilians. Are you telling me you actually got an ethic that says that the Viet Cong and the NVA were engaged in impermissible activities because they engaged in a military defense against a military invasion? Well, it's military to those people over there. Just because this is a self-exempted zone where the same rules don't apply does not actually stand up for the rest of the world. And whether or not they're terrified by U.S. air power at this moment, you can trust me on this one. The bulk of the world is saying it's about time. And if you guys had done it another way on your own in some sense, and I'm not saying you guys to you people, I'm saying that's what they're saying to all of us. If you've been effectual in some sense, at some point, this might not have been necessary. But as it
Hot
stands,
take.
it was absolutely necessary, and it was absolutely empowering, even if they get beat, that they actually drew blood where it counted, because it's their blood being shed in a continuous hemorrhage out there, unnoticed. No one cares. No one really cares. There's this whole predication in America about innocents being paid that we didn't know. We didn't know about those 500,000 Iraqi children. There have been 2 UN commissioners resigned back to back. One went on a speaking tour in North America saying that he had resigned in protest to the policy of deliberate genocide imposed upon Iraq by the United States. This was reported in the New York Times for 3 weeks. Madeleine Albright went on 60 Minutes, and the question was posed. We've been hearing from the UN commissioners about these 500,000 children. What's the truth to this? She said, yeah, it's, as near as I can tell, pretty accurate. We just said it was worth the cost. There's a difference between not knowing and not caring. And if you're out there on the receiving end of that and get the response that you saw in this country to those statements, the only conclusion you could possibly draw is that nobody cares. Okay, what do we do now?
I think you could probably make a comparison to this with ecological refugees that face climate catastrophe, and I think you can make a parallel with things like the children in the ICE detainment centers that, you know, we tacitly know about the horribleness, but if you look at what the direct response is outside of, say, Willem von Spronsen or something, what does that mean? I always go through phases of wishing that I was practicing Spanish every day, and I don't do it. And so, like, I must not really want to do it that badly if I never do. So in a way, you know, we have to wonder to what extent are we making, you know, a sort of cost-benefit analysis. We think that this global warming is terrible, or this foreign policy is terrible, or we think the ICE detainment centers are terrible in a moral sense. We're morally opposed to them, but you know, actions speak louder than words, as the old adage goes. If we're not engaging in effective tactics against these things, to what extent are we, you know, really against them? It's kind of a scary thought.
We're going to rely on those guys to mount a movement that's going to put a stop to this? Yeah. By the time pigs fly. Understand, the days of immunity and self-exemption from the costs and consequences of what's dished out are over. That message was sent loud and clear. Those people worried about those children on those aircraft are your own children, or me for mine. And I probably fly more than anybody in this room, so I'm probably proportionately more subject to being turned into a passenger of one of those cruise missiles. And so be it. You want your children to be safe, stop killing other people's babies, or looking the other way while they die. See, that's a real simple message. It can be understood by anybody from the bowling alley to Pittsburgh to PhD level faculty members at the University of California at Berkeley. Nobody's confused about it, and we can put that message out off of this. They gave us the opportunity to do something different. And I'm not entirely convinced myself they don't have the capacity to drop the other foot if this keeps up, and there isn't a coherent response that is of the right sort, and that is the right sort. See, it's the line from Lawrence Sampson out of Cotton Club. I'll go off into movies now. We'll do a little cultural studies moment. All right? It was that simple a message that got missed because of this exceptionalist attitude that's been taken in all quarters in this society. Fishburne was playing a real-life 1930s Harlem gangster by the name of Bumpy Johnson, who, when they desegregated the Cotton Club, went to the guy who was the bouncer who had persecuted black people for all the years when they were excluded. Took a delight in it, and the entertainers too. Took the guy, slammed his head up against the wall, stuck his head in the toilet and flushed, pulled him back out and said, what you don't understand, and you got to learn, is when you push people around, somebody's going to push back. Cotton Club, I'll bet you want it. Same character, okay, he liked playing the part so much in Cotton Club, he made a whole movie about it.
I don't talk about cover level. I have a question.
Okay.
It's okay. In
Just fine.
Introduction to Classical Pathology, Ed specifically talks about
Okay. Ed Mead in the introduction to Pacifism as Pathology. And for those who don't know, Ed Mead was an individual who engaged in armed struggle in the 1970s, was apprehended, convicted, and did 20 some odd years. I don't remember exactly how long. It was an eternity in maximum security as a result, and came out just before the book was put together, and wrote this. He did not, however, say at any point that armed struggle was wrong. He also doesn't refer to it as violence. Armed struggle is armed struggle, okay? What he said was that there had been miscalculations on the part of the group that he was a participant in, and maybe more broadly in the movement, as to the propriety and emphasis that should be placed on armed struggle at a particular point in the early 1970s when he went down. And that was counterproductive. It was counterproductive in a couple of ways, not least of which was a bunch of people who were seriously committed, unswervingly committed, as a matter of fact, ended up dead or in cages as a result, and the movement lost those, and it also intimidated people who weren't as clear in their politics as the people who were engaged in the armed struggle. And so there's questions of context that have to be raised. What's the condition of the consciousness of the movement at the time when something is considered? What is it that you hope to achieve by it? And that has to be clearly understood, and does the potential cost, okay, because you can always lose people. You have to just factor that in. Are you going to gain more than you're likely to lose by it? It's a real military kind of calculus. It's also a political calculus. Can you explain what happened in terms that will lead to a greater clarity of consciousness among people who are not yet politically engaged? Do you have the possibility of doing that in any broad sense? Or will it be something appropriated and articulated back through the edifice of mass media and so on in a way that is entirely contrary to itself and counterproductive in that sense? Well, those implicate a bunch of things. And no, I cannot give you a situation analysis because I don't have a situation to give you an analysis of. Okay, not specific, and it is very specific. It's contextually specific. It has to be something that arises out of the immediacy of the conditions one confronts. One not only as an individual, but one as a group as well. Okay, you get a broader movement than that, then you get the interactivity and there's a greater degree of complexity. And as I say, these tactical considerations fit into an overall strategy. What are you trying to accomplish overall, in the end? How does this fit into it? You're looking to reform the state so it's kinder, gentler, fascist, imperialist power? Or you want to abolish it? I mean, that's a fundamental kind of question. Yeah, well, in your case, maybe I get that clarity. But if I said 9 people, probably this is not a representative sample in this room, okay? If I said 9 random people who identify themselves as somehow or another being a part of the movement, however we're going to define it, because it seems a multiplicity of special interests that are each operating out there, is since somebody, some brilliant soul, probably a postmodernist of some sort, announced that there was no hierarchy of oppression, okay? Makes all forms of oppression equal, everyone, yeah, right.
So a little history background on that statement. The no hierarchy of oppression is an important issue. It's a matter of intersectionality to say that, you know, someone says, you know, okay, class is the most, you know, important oppression. They do kind of a class reductionist thing. And someone else says, you know, oh, well, race is the most important oppression because, you know, people's race is, you know, immediately judged upon appearance as opposed to your class, which someone might not know just by looking at you. Oh, no, well, sexism is the most important because even if you grow up in a culturally, racially homogenous location, the sexism to say, okay, there is no hierarchy of oppression. We all, you know, face various oppressions at different degrees. Maybe your oppression on one axis in intersectionality is more extreme than someone else's oppression on the same thing. You know, maybe your the way that sexism impacts you is harsher than maybe the way sexism is impacting this other person, the way that classism impacts you. And so there is that, but I feel like that has muddied the waters a little bit, because then people will say, okay, well, there's no hierarchy of oppression. It's ultimately just as important to address this issue here as it is to address this issue here. And then you aren't able to properly articulate that maybe, you know, one issue is more important than the other. Maybe stopping you know, a war is should have more prominence than doing some minor action in a different locality.
So since I'm oppressed by smokers, my combat against ashtrays is equivalent to your combat against genocide, and probably you should come over and spend some time with me anyway because it's more important because it's here. Yeah, you get this kind of stuff. They're not real clear what the game goal is supposed to be. Well, we got a whole lot of consciousness work that goes into that, but the consciousness work cannot be a not mutually exclusive, self-contained process. That's the bit about we read a lot of books, and then we write a lot of books, make sure everybody's informed continuously, I don't know, speaking truth to power, and we end up like Homi Bhabha announcing that writing is actually akin to warfare. In fact, writing is warfare. In fact, writing is the only valid kind of warfare because all the rest of them are going to be subject to these class analysis and critiques, and there's always going to be this unrepresentative quality to it. You really can't engage in anything that's not counterproductive, and so scribble on. Yeah. Yeah. So we got a lot of sharpening to do, all right? But it has to be a practical kind of sharpening, which is not just an intellectual thing and not just, oh, hey, let's go out and burn the SUVs in a car lot kind of thing. We're here to fuck things up. Doesn't quite provide enough analysis for most people, okay? We got to take the theory, inform the practice, and from the practice, learn how to alter the theory and have that kind of thing going, but with the clarity that we really do want to affect a fundamental change, which means an abolition of the existing structure. That's the only fundamental change that's at hand. So no, we don't get them to pass a new rule that prevents somebody from doing something that we don't like, and no, we don't get a new rule that keeps them from putting something in the food that we don't like, and no, we're not going to go to the legislature and lobby, and no, we're not probably going to get an ultimate solution by going to court and filing a suit, and when you get done by process of elimination, taking out the things that aren't going to lead in that direction in the end, although they may have at any given moment a certain tactical expediency, we may engage in litigation, we may engage in lobbying, not as be-all end-all that it's going to achieve our result, but it leads towards that purpose of actually having a thing undone, in pieces, gone, and something else in its place. Long, long time in this country before I encountered that kind of consciousness in any particular broad sense, as opposed to confusion. That has to do with the nature of the discourse, that has to do with the nature of self-indulgence. Sense of privilege. It's repudiated. Still exists. And I'll own it too. The question was, could I point to historical organizations that, in my opinion, have been effective? Okay? And in varying ways. Obviously, none of them have been effective enough because we're still in this country, okay? But in slices and in moments from which we can learn both what it is they did right and what it was that was done wrong. And defects in a broader base of support is a big one there, and that needs to be owned. Okay, we have critiques of an organization that was created right here in Oakland, California called the Black Panther Party. Okay? The Black Panther Party accomplished some amazing things in a 3-year period of time, right? And as a result of the amazing things it accomplished, it was targeted, seriously targeted for elimination by the federal government, and all of a sudden you heard this wild, it was like birds chirping out there in the forest, thousands of them all singing a different tune, all the excuses and prevarications and critiques of the Black Panthers and what was wrong with their practice and how they weren't representative and how they were macho and yeah, that's why we can't support them. In other words, distance ourselves, isolate them, and let the feds eat them alive. I could accuse the movement that got put so back of my day. This isn't even contemporary. This is when I was on the so-called cutting edge and young and all of that, of gross cowardice. This isn't even faulty analysis. This is contriving an analysis to cover your cowardice. It's what that came down to on a mass scale. And that's glorified at this point. There's only now beginning to be some serious reconsideration, rehabilitation of Black Panther Party, which actually achieved something, as opposed to all those chatterers out there who were creating propaganda for the state to discredit the party, to excuse their running off and staying safe from it.
I mean, this parallels with the things that people are saying right now a lot about cancel culture, in a way, sort of doing the state's work, or doing the state's work, or maybe you could argue doing, Steven Crowder and Dennis Prager and stuff, doing their work for them by eating each other alive. I've often referred to the left as sometimes appearing, probably to the outside observer, as a bee's nest. The way that it's just people wouldn't even want it to go into it, because it'd be like going into a bee's nest, the way that we often engage with each other in a critical way.
Okay, who never did a damn thing, went nowhere. That's one. American Indian movement was...
Oh my goodness. I don't know why Internet Explorer is terrible at just maintaining the speed. I do prefer Firefox, but Firefox runs very slow on my computer for some reason. It didn't always run slow, but
one.
I don't know. I don't know enough about computers to fix this.
Hell, half this country seriously believed Indians were extinct right along with Buffalo. American Indian movement put American Indians.
Why does it sound like that?
Consciousness, big time. Major accomplishment. You could go back to the industrial workers of the world, take a completely different kind of example. You got an actual labor movement, union, radical politics that is bent upon abolition of the extant system, that had over 1 million members, done in by the labor movement, in concert with the feds. There have been examples that we could pull from. I could go on. Black Liberation Army in a different way still. FALN, Manchateros. There's examples. Thing is, those that were successful in defining their terms were primarily armed formations, and in that sense, self-defeating, okay, because in prematurely perhaps adopting an armed cant. They cut themselves off in a mass movement that was not prepared, or refusing of the consciousness that was required to give the fish a sea in which to swim. Now basically each one of these organizations was destroyed by the refusal of the broader movement to support it. And by that I don't mean participating in its armed actions, but by refusing it the kind of support that would allow it to survive. Sanctuary, for example. Propaganda that would justify and explain what it is that they were engaged in, so that the broader body politic would understand it. Things like that. Things like that. So
the little pamphlet called Mini Manual of the Urban Guerrilla discusses this, that we have a, there either needs to be through the public support or through the movement itself some sort of propaganda arm that tries at least its best to, the way that the Occupy movement, was portrayed in the media as like hurting local businesses and that it's like mostly homeless people that aren't political and doesn't really have a message or whatever. Obviously, the Occupy movement's very simple message of inequality, 99% versus 1%, was hard for the media to distort, but they will always try to do that. So it's important to have a propaganda wing to your movement.
you hand them over to Ted Koppel and wonder why nobody could understand what it is they were trying to do or say. Yeah. I think, I agree with you. What was said was a single action of the nature of 911 is insufficient in and of itself to accomplish anything much beyond, well, is that fair? Anything much beyond itself? Yeah, I think that's a general drift of what you had to say. It needs to be followed up by actions probably not on the same scale, and I think I already said that. I don't know that it needs to be repeated. I think it changed the calculus of a lot of things for a lot of people that are not a part of this community but are on the receiving end of what is done in order to make this community possible, okay? And I don't think we should discount the ramification that effect, okay? But with that said, I think you did a brilliant job of giving yourself a homework assignment. Because you're right, it does need to be followed up. That's the whole point. So get busy, all right? And that's open to everybody and inclusive of me. And in that sense, it was exemplary. Not exemplary in the sense it sets a template of things that we have to do. We're not going to repeat 911. Nor do we necessarily have to. What we have to do is make it clear that this isn't a simple, abstract debating game. We're here, we play by this polite set of rules and express our moral anguish, while those who are doing what they're doing that we're expressing the anguish about continue to do what they're doing so that we can be properly anguished. No, the point is, look, you got to stop. And if you don't stop, bad things are going to happen. And here's a taste. Now, if you don't want that to happen again, stop. Oh, you didn't stop. Here's another taste.
I think this is an important distinction to make. The next lecture touches on this a little bit as well, that you can have a certain level of effectiveness with one large action, but it needs to be something that's ongoing or continuing or will, as Ward Churchill is now saying, have incremental increases if your ultimate goal is change. Because a quote I'd used in a previous video regarding the Seattle protest is like, oh, look, we shut down the WTO. We had this massive protest. Let's just do this every single time. Well, of course, by the next time a similar movement is about to happen, you have police showing up way ahead of time, confiscating people's food, confiscating people's, the giant puppets and other stuff like that, or, mass arresting people before the protest even happens, and this kind of things. They learn from their mistakes. In the one sense, they learn from their mistakes and try and make things like after Occupy movement happens, they put things in place to make it so that can't happen again. At the same time, we can't have this one action, this one success story, and leave it at that. We need to have a growing movement, which the next speaker will discuss as well.
Okay, you didn't stop. Another taste. Ready to stop yet? And I'm sort of being flip about this, but it's kind of the way it works. And it comes off exactly what you said. But why is it just the people out there who are most remote and absent resources and all the rest of stuff, not proximate to the belly, the center of the power, I was going to say the belly of the beast, the centers of power from which this emanates, why is it always a burden they carry? Makes much more sense that the burden be carried by those who say they act and stand in solidarity with the suffering out there, huh? Well, if you're actually in solidarity with them, do something tangible to make it stop. Prayer vigils are real nice, and I like lit candles in the night as much as anybody else, but it's never, ever in the history of humanity been known to stop a bullet. It's never been known to feed a child. It's never been known to have the least persuasive effect on those in power.
Harsh.
It does, however, make those who do it feel better, apparently. I got a humble proposition to offer the group. Let's feel better after we win, okay? Then we can have a party. in a sort of a sci-fi or fantasy scenario, you've conceived of something out there that could eradicate this whole monstrosity. Only to confront the realization that would mean that you'd have to go with it. But wouldn't that be arithmetically or mathematically acceptable? Because wouldn't the planet as a whole be much better off without us all? Whoa.
The system is destroying life.
Well, yeah, if you want to identify with the system in some fatalistic and disempowered fashion, say there's ultimately nothing I can do to change it, okay? Yeah, if it was some static entity in which you were embedded, truly, everyone and everything would be better off without it, you, me, all of it, okay? So our only hope of redemption, in more ways than one, is to engage in a process consciously and otherwise that allows us to be empowered to the point that we can actually challenge in the process of confronting, transform power into something other than it is. This system cannot be allowed to sustain itself, okay? It cannot, it must be destroyed. That doesn't mean that every human component part of it has to go along with it. Which is to say, I ain't Pol Pot, okay? I can conceive of other options. Does that mean the process is a painless one? No, it doesn't. It's not painless now. There's probably a lot of the people in this room that can make personal testimony to the fact that the nature of the extant social, political, and economic reality is not painless. Well, let me tell you, you get outside this country or into some other communities besides the one that we're sitting in here together tonight, and that quantitative and qualitative experiencing of pain goes up astronomically. It's not a painless situation. There's going to be pain involved in changing it, but guess what? There's pain involved in not changing it. Yeah? The pain can be alleviated by eliminating its source. And that's probably the only way you alleviate the pain in the end. There's not a way of alleviating the pain by eliminating the source, however, that preserves the privileges of those who benefit from its existence. That's what I meant about there's not a pill that can be taken that will bring about a painless resolution while preserving the privileges of those who are seeking such a solution. Americans are not, as a rule, entitled to what they got. And that includes those workers who are just so oppressed that they cannot possibly pay attention to the fact that there's something more important in the world than their bowling score. American workers, as compared to the working class of other countries, what we're talking in terms of class solidarity, are the most overindulged group of people the planet's ever seen. And the fact that they feel oppressed because they can't have a new $40,000 pickup truck and the mortgage is overbearing because they decided that they had to live in an 8-bedroom suburban ranch house. I mean, they don't build houses in this country anymore. It's partly because they got yo-yos that'll mortgage themselves into eternity in order to buy something that's 3 times the size of anything they might possibly need.
Before the mortgage crash, of course.
And I can't accept that as being oppression in any sense that's comprehensible to me in the first place. It's more like choice, and that's a problem, okay? Much less that it's the kind of, even if it is oppressive because they're deluded into choice, and that's as a result of advertising media manipulation, it's a kind of oppression that entitles them to turn away from starving babies. Sorry. And that argument was actually advanced. The reason the working class is so right-wing here is because they're so oppressed. Well, I'm not denying oppression. I'm not denying oppression at all.
Michael Albert makes an interesting critique of basically the argument that Ward Churchill is making, that say for example, Michael Albert addresses an audience. You have a guy that he gets off work and he goes and cracks open a 6-pack and watches the football game. What do you consider this person to be doing with their time? Do you consider it a valuable use of their time? The audience of leftists says, no, that's not a good use of their time. Okay, so what should they be doing? The first answer is, well, they should be playing the sport instead of watching it. Okay, well, they just got off work, so they're tired. Plus, everyone's got all kinds of different schedules. Plus, the parks and stuff in America have been defunded and stuff, so I don't know where he's supposed to play. That's kind of a classist take right there. Okay, what else should he do? Then people say, well, he should read. Well, what kind of thing should he read? They say he should read Noam Chomsky and stuff. Okay, so this guy gets off work. All of his buddies go and watch the game. He goes and reads Chomsky instead. Well, now he's angry, about the state of the world. He's feels maybe powerless to change it. He goes back to work. He can't talk with his buddies at work because they all watch the game rather than reading. And he uses this argument to say that a lot of times our view of a person going to watch the game as opposed to reading theory or something, that they're wasting their time, when really, the way that the system is set up, they're acting, totally normally. They're looking for some brevity and some fun in what limited discretionary time they have outside of work. It's very classist to make this assumption of people. And that would be, I guess, Michael Albert's critique of Ward Churchill here, saying that, okay, if you're a working class person, but you own like a pickup truck and you're concerned with your bowling score as opposed to other things, well then, maybe you're not really working class or whatever, kind of doing this Maoist third worldist kind of take, which I can see the rationale of it. I don't know to what extent I totally believe it.
But this oppression is, well, the term that got to be real popular about 10 years ago, this is an oppression that is created by the hierarchy. The hierarchy. And that's the same people who tell me there's no hierarchy to oppression. If the oppression is being visited upon you by a hierarchy, how in the hell could it avoid being hierarchical? You know? And since there is a hierarchy of oppression, on the hierarchy of oppression, this oppression doesn't count for very much as compared to the oppression with which they ought to be concerned. And another point that was raised a little while ago that I never really did address because I got a little irritated was I'm not actually making a moral argument. I'm responding to a moral argument. So the nature of my response is going to assume those terms because of the assertion of moral superiority on the part of those who would be self-neutralizing. Okay? I know babies are dying just as well as you do, but I burned a candle about it, and therefore I'm more superior too. Oh, yeah, right. That's the terms of the discourse. I didn't create it. I think there's material reasons to do this. There's moral reasons as well, but morality is a variable thing. It's kind of personal. So I won't impose mine on you. The only thing I demand in return is you don't impose yours on me. I think with that in mind, there's a lot of principles that we can agree upon. Like it ain't right, by whatever calculus you want to employ, to finance cappuccinos and BMWs off starving kids in the third world. I think we can all agree on that, okay? If they'd flown the planes at midnight, the building would have been full of cleaning personnel.
Well,
They would have hit all those.
well, but say that there would be a time of day when there was no one in, you know, but, I mean, there were cleaning.
As a hypothetical, no, actually I wouldn't in this case because they were targeting those people I referred to as little Eichmanns who are making the world economic system hum to the service of the United States and at their expense. These were legitimate targets in the terms that have been imposed. Yes, I know there were some janitors in the building, there were some food service workers, there were probably some people getting off the subway, and so on. I don't think they were appropriately targeted. As a matter of fact, I don't think they were targeted at all. The upper floors of those buildings were occupied primarily by Cantor Fitzgerald. Yeah, that's actually the bond trading firm that took out 1/3 of its overall personnel and the cream of its bond traders, one fell swoop. That's who were waving their shirts out the windows because they had the upper floors all the way up.
Cantor Fitzgerald probably already has hired on all its new bond traders. There's a list of
Being an international bond trader is something they fill out of manpower, you know. These people had 20 and 30 years, some of them invested in being the most competent people in the world, and they're not replaceable in an immediate sense. It's not to say they're not replaceable, okay, just not in an immediate sense. There was a serious blow done. And what is Colin Powell's term? Infrastructure. This is command and control infrastructure, okay?
Not to extend it too far, but how about if they had let off a suitcase near south of 14th Street?
How about we make all those starving babies just symbolic?
Yeah.
Then we can respond just symbolically, okay? But that's a variation on the exceptionalism. You impose real terms and real suffering on people and you want symbolic responses exclusively. No. That game's over here. And I didn't do that. I'm just reporting. On September 11th, American exceptionalist self-exemption from the terms imposed upon the rest of the planet came to an end. And for that, the people who did it owe no apology whatsoever, which is not an argument to the Taliban. I'm not a particular Taliban supporter, and I'm not a fan of bin Laden. Doesn't matter. Doesn't have to be my hero. Okay? The action was correct, given the circumstances that were created here, both by the elites who inflict the pain and by the purported opposition, which really tangibly does nothing to end it, except in the process of its ritual form, separate itself in its own mind from those who comprise the elites and feel better about themselves.
Yeah, I hope I don't get
People who
auto
are
restarted.
beneficiaries of the Holocaustal process and making them even more comfortable in their own terms they devise for themselves. I'm not quite sure they're entitled to that comfort. That's just a personal assessment. That's not a political rule. But that's kind of what I meant about, hey, let's feel good and have the party after we win. And we're not going to win by symbolic exercises. We, in what was extrapolated a while ago, is a global sense. But I want to know if there is this class solidarity between these oppressed workers here and anybody in Afghanistan, why there's been absolutely nothing about Afghanistan, even in the alternative press, for the last 10 years, while all that oppression is now being hands wrung about what's going on.
This is an important thing, I think, to note that that was basically the end of the thing. It's an important thing to note, you know, the justification for a lot of the war on terror and stuff is that it was helping the women. And there was a female lecturer, I want to say it was, her name is like Sadiva, an Indian woman who I've used her, I believe, in a video, used part of her lecture in a video in the past, but she said, you know, do we really want, you know, Afghanistan to be bombed into a feminist paradise? And they try and, you know, whether it's responding to 9/11 or a migration crisis, and they contort in this way to justify the actions that they're doing, or they justify it after the fact. They go into Afghanistan, oh, we're here to save the women. They justify it after the fact. And we can't, let them do that justification, whether that's U.S. foreign policy saying, oh, well, we're going in and look, we found that there's this problem and we're going to solve it, or whether that's just, in the political discourse where you have, like, let's say right-wing people saying that the civil rights movement and stuff was a Republican movement, and it was like the Democrats were the original KKK or whatever. They're justifying it, after the fact. So you shouldn't let them do that, because they're liars and they're lying.
Very infrequent. With all of that said, I would like to thank you all very much for being here. It's been real.
All right. Awesome. So that is one video down. Did we talk about the Mujahideen? I did a brief, like, where did 9/11 come from in the very beginning of the stream before I looked at any lectures, giving a rundown, and I discussed the Mujahideen. I have 4 lectures here. We're probably only going to get to 3 of them, I think, because this is running pretty long already. The next lecture you might have seen because it was already on YouTube by Michael Albert, and then the lecture after that was not on YouTube that I could find. So you might find that interesting. And then the fourth lecture was already on YouTube by Michael Prenti, but I don't know if we will get to that. But I will put all of these videos. They're set to private right now. I will put them to public and put them into the lectures playlist on my channel after all this. Are we having fun? Are we ready for the next segment? This is I think the longest lecture. I think the next one is like 40 minutes. The next one's like 20 minutes. So hopefully you all are enjoying this reflexive look at 9/11. Yep, more lectures. Let's do it. Let's learn all about 9/11.
As mentioned, I was asked to talk about terrorism, the quote war on terrorism.
This one's more specifically about 9/11.
So I'll do that. I prefer discussion to lecture. How many of you are familiar with ZNet? Hands up if you are. Under those circumstances, there's even more reason to prefer discussion to presentation, because you probably have already heard and read most of what I have to say. Nonetheless, I'll do what I was asked for, but I will try and do it relatively rapidly. What happened on September 11th? I don't know. Most of you probably, like me, I was, well, a little bit different. I was working away at the computer on ZNet, and Lydia called me and said, you got to come in here. And I did, and we watched. And we saw the buildings go down, and we saw them go down, and we saw them go down, and we saw them go down. And we saw the media do something that was quite interesting, I thought. They looked at a calamity, and they gave the human dimensions of it. This is not all bad. That is to say, the media looked into this horrible occurrence, this attack which killed many, many, many people, and it gave the human dimensions of the suffering. They demonstrated that they were capable of doing that. Now, what's wrong with that is not that they did it. What's wrong with it is that Iraq has suffered the equivalent of a September 11th every week for about 10 years in sum total, and they haven't done it once.
That's because it was brown people, probably, among other things, in another country is another thing, caused by the U.S., probably another reason. But I do think that's an important statement to make. I feel like foreign policy, a lot of times they'll point to one bad thing. For example, they'll point to, ISIS, beheaded a journalist on TV. We got to go get him. Meanwhile, the U.S. fully backs Saudi Arabia, who beheads like 80 people a year. The U.S. will be all over getting rid of, Gaddafi is like a tyrant. Meanwhile, the U.S. is funding a way worse tyrant over here, whatever, in Angola or something, right? So important to keep in mind. But yeah, so right off the bat, Michael Albert saying the news has demonstrated that it can look at a calamity and show the human dimensions of it. Why won't they do this for other issues? Let's keep going.
So the capacity to reach in and understand the human and social and just, direct day-to-day dimensions of a horrible event exists in American media. Keep that in mind as we go forward. So it happened. We could talk about the motive of whoever planned it. On September 12th, I was suggesting that I thought it was very likely that bin Laden was in some way or another connected with what went on. I still think it is. Let's assume it for the sake of the discussion. We don't know it for sure. I suspect that the motives had zero to do with American culture, zero to do with American freedom, zero to do with anything American. They had to do with a desire to change regimes in the Mideast, to try and draw the United States into behavior that would destabilize regimes in the Mideast. We could ask about why the people who did it. There's another interesting thing that is often not talked about. The people who were in those planes were here for probably a year or two. You know, like in World War II, when the Japanese pilots engaged in kamikaze flights, which is basically the same idea at another point in history.
Thank you, Rulodos, for the super chat. Very much appreciated. I am a radical puppo. That is true. That is the facts.
They were nurtured by a community that would rev them up and that would get them into a mindset to be able to do this. I don't think ever in modern history, probably never in history, has anyone gone off, lived in a hostile environment, isolated from everybody who thinks like they do, and engaged in sort of undercover particular act. Whatever we think about that act is truly mind-boggling, I think. And so we have to ask, what motivated the people who did it? I suspect there, unlike the people who planned it, there was the motivations connected to injustice, connected to oppression, connected to trying to fight back. There's a way to know that. When bin Laden gives a speech, he talks about that stuff. He talks about the United States in Iraq. He talks about the Palestinians. He talks about, why does he do that? Well, because that's what he needs to say to galvanize support for the agendas that he has. Just like the United States, the President of the United States talks about freedom and justice instead of talking about oppressing people to galvanize support for what he's doing. It's quite comparable. Bin Laden had no concern at all for the Palestinian people. Bin Laden had no concern at all for people who are suffering and poor around the world. Anybody who had concern and was in a position to think would realize that the acts undertaken would hurt such people, not benefit them, as we see it doing all around the globe.
So Ward Churchill is disagreeing with Michael Albert here. He'd said that, well, why would the U.S. is using 9/11 as justification for engaging in these conflicts, but the U.S. was going to engage in these conflicts already. They just are having to do it in a more open, more crass fashion. I think I agree maybe more with Michael Albert here on account of, I know from reading William Blum's work and reading Michael Parenti's work, that the U.S. was trying to organize foreign policy around a war on terror, blaming like I'd said before, Gaddafi in Libya for a lot of terrorist acts in the 80s, trying to get people to be scared. It didn't quite take off. But then 9/11 comes in, and now the justification sticks.
What makes the acts despicable? An attack on civilians for political purposes. That is indeed the definition of terrorism. An attack on civilians for political purposes. I think that's despicable. What happened since September 11th? Well, the first thing that happened is the United States told Pakistan to close the border to Afghanistan. What does that mean? Afghanistan is a country in which the average lifespan is in the mid-40s, in which 1/3 of the population is literate, in which the country was suffering a tremendous crisis for food, and in which it was recovering, not really recovering, it was coming out of a decade-long war. In that context, the United States told Pakistan to close the borders in order to interrupt the flow of food. Aid workers around the world, Christian aid, UN aid agencies, basically all the aid organizations that were concerned with providing food to the Afghan population, immediately and universally, without a single dissent, said, if you even talk about bombing, much less if you bomb, it will disrupt the flow of food into Afghanistan. Disrupting the flow of food into Afghanistan for any extended period of time going into the winter is likely to kill millions of people. Nobody, any place in the world, contested this prognosis. That's very important to understand. Nobody said, that's false. Nobody in the U.S. government said it. Nobody else said it any place. Why? Because it was the best estimate, it was the best prediction of what the implications would be of engaging in bombing. So the first thing we did is tell them to close the border. The second thing we did, we being the United States, is, I don't know, they met in the Pentagon or whatever, and then we started bombing. We bombed rubble into dust. We bombed Afghanistan with everything short of nuclear weapons. We bombed knowing and believing that what we were doing was going to, or could, kill millions of people. There was no expectation on Rumsfeld's part that it would end quickly. The expectation was that it would go through the whole winter. So the United States was engaging in a set of actions that could kill millions.
Hey, Sabo.
Immediately after September 11th, in the U.S. Congress, some bills came back on the floor. Military spending bills that had been voted down were reintroduced to be voted up. repressive bills that you're all aware of that would never have stood a chance were pushed through. These are
So to discuss his previous point about the U.S. engaging in activity that they knew would cause a problem, the Michael Albert lecture that I uploaded recently on why protest and why dissent and with what logic, that lecture, if the folks of you have seen that I uploaded, he argues that, you know, the people in power, they know what they're doing. So this speaking truth to power thing is kind of silly, as Churchill argued. You know, you speak truth to power, but power knows what it's doing. I mean, it's the reason that they're doing it. So to do so, you know, is maybe not the most effective thing to do. So we have to wonder, you know, when you know, Trump engages in changing rules a little bit around the immigration detention centers, and you have this migrant concentration camps all over the U.S. nightmare that's going on, or whether you have, you know, the various whatever 7 to 10 countries we happen to be bombing at any given moment, you know, to give them, don't be charitable with their rationale, because they might be telling the public one thing, but they do know full well the consequences of what they're doing. So that's one point. My second point, I forgot. So let's keep playing, and then maybe it will come back to me.
the things that happened. Now let's ask what was going on in the mindset or the minds of U.S. elites. What were the motivations at stake? Well, the buildings were knocked down. Something had to be done. Why? We'll see in a second. The first thing, basically, we're considering our policy. And there were certain...
That previous lecture was not actually from 2005. That was just the video I used. So you notice this is the real video of the lecture because the video from this lecture happens to exist. The other video, as well as the next one after this, there is no video for the lecture, and so I just took video of a previous... I took a video from a different lecture of the same person so that there's something visual to look at, even if, you know, obviously the video and the lecture aren't connected. So that is why that is. And that's why if you look at like Michael Albert's lecture on anarchist economics that I uploaded a while back, that one is also all grainy and stuff, and that's because that's actually Michael Albert's lecture on participatory economics, but I just used that footage over the lecture for which I have no video for. So that's what it's all about.
Constraints on what the U.S. could do. The first constraint was delegitimate international law. Why? Because if we legitimate international law, it is applicable to us. Because if we strengthen international law, it could be brought to bear on our acts in Iraq, on the fact that we've been waging chemical and biological warfare, that is, withholding food and medicines, chemical and biological warfare against the population of Iraq to the tune of 1 million corpses. It could be used against that. It could be used against U.S. policy in various places around the world. So it is necessary from our point of view, from the U.S. point of view, whatever we do with regard to this terrorist attack, and it was a terrorist attack in New York City, whatever we do, we have to delegitimate rather than legitimate international law. This is why when the Taliban said, give us evidence that bin Laden was responsible and we will send him out, we will export him, the United States didn't even think about providing evidence. Whether they have it or not, they would not provide it, because to provide it would say, we have to do that. It is incumbent upon us to offer evidence. But the United States position is that we have to do nothing. Nothing is incumbent upon us. We do whatever we want, and everybody has to relate the way we say they have to relate. And the last thing we want to do is legitimate the notion that we are subject to any norms outside of Washington, D.C. and Wall Street. The second constraint was admitted. It was said out front. We have to maintain credibility, was the formulation. What does maintain credibility mean? Well, suppose one of you were to borrow some money from the mafia and be late in your payment. What would the mafia do? They would send somebody to collect. Suppose you refuse to pay. They'd break your legs, right? Suppose they liked you. Your friends. They'd break your legs anyway. Why? Because they have to maintain credibility. What does it mean? It means they can't establish the principle, establish the idea that it is okay to cross and to violate them. They have to maintain credibility. If you can come up with some other explanation for what maintain credibility means in the question and answer period, I'd like to hear it. That's what I think it means. It's a technical term, an obfuscatory, a lying term, to label the intention of saying to the world, again, we are a thug, and we will do whatever is necessary when we are crossed, and it will never be abrogated. We will always do it. We have to maintain credibility. The third constraint wasn't actually a constraint. It was an opportunity. September 11th was a huge, as gross as it is to think in these terms, a huge opportunity for U.S. elites. Because it said to them, look, you can reinvigorate something that you pursued in the past, that Bush Sr. and Reagan tried to do. They tried to re-engineer American foreign policy.
I discussed
around
this.
The idea of a war on terrorism. The terrorist network, the international terrorist cabal. This is not new. This was part of an effort by Reagan and then Bush to provide a logic for American foreign policy. What had been the prior logic? The Cold War. The Cold War was what was used, with the Soviet Union, was what was used as the organizing principle of American foreign policy. Not the actual organizing principle. The actual organizing principle is, of course, to extend and enhance American, U.S. geopolitical and economic interests. That's what's really behind U.S. foreign policy. But what's needed is something to tell the American people. You can't go on TV and say to the American people, we are supporting the Contras in Nicaragua. We are supporting a bunch of bloodthirsty thugs who are running around the countryside killing people and raping people. And the reason we are doing this is because we don't want the Nicaraguans to use the resources that are under the ground in Nicaragua and the energies of the people of Nicaragua on behalf of populations in Nicaragua. Rather, we want those resources and assets to be utilized for the advantage of people in the United States, elites and corporate elites in the United States. You can't get on TV and say that. If Bush or Bush Sr. or Reagan or anybody else gets on TV and says that, it doesn't fly. It's gross. It is immoral. It is all the things that would arouse passionate opposition.
This is a point that I've wanted to use this clip in videos in the past, and it's just the way that it's worded doesn't quite work for the purposes I've wanted to use it, but it is important to keep in mind, and I imagine those of you that are watching are hip to this already, but that, obviously, whatever percentage, 80, 90% of the reasons given for U.S. foreign policy are fallacious, right? Michael Prenti has this thing where he was... Both this quote that Michael Albert gives and also a quote that Michael Prenti gives, I was going to use, I think, in my review of Anarchism and Other Essays, and neither quote really worked quite how I liked, so I didn't use them. But Michael Prenti's quote was, why were we in Vietnam? And he's looking for, people explaining what are U.S. interests. What are these U.S. interests? We have to go because it's the U.S. interest. What is this U.S. interest? And he finds that, the U.S. interest is rubber, and it's economic. It's for the people that have economic ties in the subjugation of Vietnam, which is not us, not the people that are paying the taxes for that policy. I think Michael Parenti's a very good line that he delivers on this in regards to the war on terror and justifying it through getting the cheap oil prices. Well, okay, if you look at the numbers, we're spending twice as much on the foreign policy as we are getting back in the oil. Well, but who's getting the oil versus who's paying the foreign policy? The oil barons will spend $2 of your money to protect $1 of their money. They'll spend $10 of your money to protect their money. In fact, when it comes to protecting their money, your money is no object, is how it's beautiful the way that Michael Prenti explains that. I love it. All right, let's keep going.
Instead, you get on TV and you say, in the case of the Contras, we are going to support the Contras in order to induce freedom in Nicaragua and to oppose and to thwart the vile plans of the Great Bear of the Soviet Union to come into the United States through Nicaragua by way of Texas. So the Cold War provided an organizing principle to do what? To scare the population, to coerce the American population into doing things, into supporting things, or at least not opposing things that otherwise would have been impossible. And that's what Reagan and Bush Sr. were trying to do when they tried to create the ethos of an international terror network, to provide a new way to scare the U.S. population. And it didn't work. And Bush Jr., using September 11th, is now embarked on the same thing. And thus we have the war on terrorism, which is supposed to last a decade or 5 decades or whatever. Well, the first notable thing about the war on terrorism is it isn't a war. The United States doesn't fight wars. The last war the United States fought was in Vietnam. The United States fights massacres, right? They're inaptly called wars. It is not a war when one side loses 5 people because a helicopter crashes and the other side has its entire country bombed into dust. This is not a war, it's a massacre. It's a shooting gallery. We do not fight with people who can fight back. right? We engage in...
You folks may have seen the meme that says, shows a stealth bomber and it says, $80 million jet, or like, what is it, $800 million jet dropping $800,000 bombs on a $1 tent, right?
Massacres. So the war on terrorism is really a massacre on terrorism. The second problem with the name is that it doesn't have anything to do with terrorism. If we were trying to reduce terrorism, we would not be engaging in terrorism on a massive scale. Remember what the definition of terrorism was? Attacking civilians for political purposes. So just exactly what were we doing when we bombed the country of Afghanistan? We were bombing civilians throughout the country of Afghanistan, potentially starving millions of them to death for political purposes. What are we doing when we withhold food and medicine from Iraq? The same thing, attacking civilians for political purposes. So we are the world's major engager in and supporter of terrorism. We wouldn't be doing that if we were trying to reduce terrorism. We also wouldn't be creating worse conditions. That is, feeding the conditions that induce people to be so desperate that they would engage in something like knocking down a building with an airplane. We would be trying to reduce those conditions. So it's not a war, and it's not about reducing terrorism. It is instead an effort to find an organizing principle that can scare the American public, that can confuse the American public, that can anger the American public, and publics throughout the world, in other countries as well, in ways that will cause them to either give in to passively or even support policies that we would otherwise not even have put up with. That's the purpose. So that's the logic and the dynamic that's associated with what's occurred. Now, during the events, I mentioned the aid workers explaining and requesting that we not bomb, that we not talk about bombing, and then we bombed. And then the aid workers basically got down on their knees, and they begged us to stop. Again, because of worry that it would cause millions of deaths. Now, the interesting point about this is that the Associated Press, the news bureau in the United States, goes out and sends reporters around the world. Now, they didn't do a great job. They didn't, it wasn't ZNet-type content coming over the Associated Press wires. But the Associated Press stories did report what the aid workers, what the health workers, what the various agencies that were responsible for basically the survival of Afghanistan were saying. And those stories went in front of every editor of every newspaper in the United States. And every editor in every newspaper in the United States decided that those stories were, if not entirely unfit to print, at most should appear in the 19th paragraph of a story appearing on page 87. They didn't on the front page put a headline, Bush about to bomb Afghanistan, risk 2 million lives to delegitimate international law and prove that we have credibility as a thug. That was not the headline, right? But even...
So this is, again, contrary to War Churchill's lecture that we just saw. So where Churchill is pointing out that, we had, members of the World Bank? No, that doesn't make sense. Members of the UN resigning over U.S. sanctions in Iraq and in protest of them, going on speaking engagements and having some stories in the press about these sanctions. So the U.S. public has no excuse for not knowing that the people of the Middle East are maybe a little ticked at U.S. foreign policy. Here, Michael Albert is making the opposite argument, essentially saying that this could have easily been main front page news, and instead, they do like a little paragraph about it, on some story like way in the back that 90% of the public doesn't read. So let's keep going.
Short of that, they didn't put any reference to the fact that everybody agreed that what we were doing was engaging in an act that could kill 2 million civilians. Think about that. Think about the system and the mindsets and the pressures that are associated with people literally just... The New York Times says we print all the news that's fit to print. They mean exactly what they say. We print all the news that's consistent with the reproduction of the social relations and the economic relations that we believe ought to persist in the United States, right? That are consistent with our authority and power and our wealth and that of people like us. The rest we do not print, or we print infinitesimally in a manner which 98% of the population will be unaware of, at most. This is pretty striking. In 35 years, I don't remember a clearer case of the narrowness and the vileness of the role of American media. And there have been plenty that are pretty horrific, but this one was a bit amazing. And just so we can put in proportion who these people are and what they think, suppose you were bin Laden, and I said to you, bin baby? I don't know what I would say. Bin, how do you refer to bin? How could you conceive and execute, let's assume you did, how could you conceive and execute an attack on these buildings, given the cost? I think bin Laden would say back something like, well, the cost was great, but given the goals that I had, we could talk about that, but given the goals that I had, I thought that what could be gained outweighed this cost. And so I pursued this course of action. Now assume that you're Bush and Rumsfeld, and I ask the same question.
Important to note here.
How could you guys sit around, plan to bomb a country from rubble to dust, with the possibility of the tremendous human cost that would follow? I think you would not understand the question, and it's not because you're stupid, although one of you is. That is, Bush is stupid, I suppose, but that's not the reason, because Rumsfeld isn't stupid. The reason that they would not understand the question is because they do not understand that there was a human cost. When they sat around in the Pentagon and
Yeah, so keep that in mind, whether it's the various, whatever, 7 to 10 countries the U.S. happens to be bombing at this moment, or whether it's the, the ICE detainment camps and stuff, they're smart enough to know what the costs are, and they're doing it anyway, so, you could reason that they don't care. Although they don't care. They know what the consequences are of the actions. So telling them, you can tell them to the extent that you can, shame them and bring that knowledge to the public. Hey, look, these world leaders recognize the consequences of what they're doing, but they are obviously engaging in these activities regardless of the consequences. And so you can reasonably assure, as Michael Albert has just said, they do not see these people as human. They're supremacists in that way. Oops.
Just what to do with full presence of the kinds of reports and predictions that I described. I don't think that they spent a day. I don't think they spent hours, an hour, 10 minutes, a minute, 20 seconds, a millisecond discussing the plight of the people who would be under the bombs and who would be starving. For them, it isn't a cost. It's like you don't think about the fact that you might step on an ant on the way out of this building. The lives of Afghans simply do not count as a human or social cost. There was nothing to calculate. If hell existed, and if it had layers, and bin Laden was in the 3rd sub-basement, you'd need a fast elevator to get down to where Bush and Rumsfeld are. What should have been the U.S. response to September 11th? Well, why don't we ask what should be the British response to people in Boston providing aid and sustenance to the IRA engaging in bombings in London? Or why don't we ask what should be the response of people all over Latin America to the United States having a school, widely known, that trains the terrorists who go down there and engage in terrorism and torture? What should their response be? What should the response of Iraq be to the United States engaging in chemical and biological warfare against Iraq? If we think that the response of these countries should be to engage in massive assaults upon the American population, then I suppose, consistently, we might think that it made sense for the United States to attack Afghans' population. But I don't think so. I think what makes sense is to go to the World Court, it's to go to institutions that exist, it's to make a case, it's to organize opposition, it's to create a dynamic which brings it to a halt and which prosecutes the perpetrators, not whole populations.
All right, so that's his solution laid out right there, first off. So that's important to note. His solution, go to institutions that exist, the World Court, the UN, whatever, and prosecute the perpetrators rather than the entire populations. I think, something that remains incredibly relevant about this argument is that there's obviously U.S. exceptionalism, a U.S. double standard. So when the U.S. goes... such and such country is politically unstable. Look at all these protests. We must do something. We have to go in. Well, after Trump was elected, there was protests. Does that mean that Canada should start bombing the U.S.? That when you change around the actors, but everything else remains the same, it makes no sense. So why is it that, political instability with protests or something in Libya, the U.S. has to go in and bomb, things going on in whatever, Syria, wherever else the U.S. goes in to bomb. If we flip that around, as Michael Albert did, saying, the Americans giving financial support to the IRA, should England respond by bombing, the U.S.? No. So the reverse doesn't make sense either. It's a helpful way to think of foreign policy.
Done, but of course, that's inconsistent with delegitimating international law. It is inconsistent with maintaining credibility, and it has nothing to do with engaging and embarking upon a war on terrorism, so it wasn't even considered. What are the prospects? Well, what should we be doing? It seems to me that what we should be doing is building movements of opposition in order to put constraints on, reverse, and eventually change foreign policy. Constraints on the war on terrorism, reverse the war on terrorism, change foreign policy, and ultimately change the institutions of our society. We should talk about this in the discussion period, but very briefly, how do you win anything? You win anything by raising social costs so high that the people who are in the position to make the change have no choice but to do so. During the war in Vietnam, elites in the United States were engaged in this barbaric assault upon Indochina. Why? To further their interests. To further the interests, the geopolitical interests and the economic interests of the United States. To prevent a good example, that is, to prevent a country from extricating itself from the U.S. imperial system and demonstrating to other countries, A, that it could be done, and B, that life would be infinitely better if you did it. That's a bad precedent. That's an example we didn't want. So it was necessary for us to present that good example that others might emulate and that others might therefore attain for themselves, thus reducing our role in the world and basically undoing the network or the empire that we had. So we wanted to prevent it. So American elites favored a war in Vietnam. During the course of the war in Vietnam, if you go back and you look at the reporting, you'll see that over time people changed their minds. And not just us, not just people who dissented, but elites. Many elite figures came out against the war. When they came out against the war, they would hold a press conference like this with 200 mics, and they would explain why they have come out against the war.
That's important.
And they wouldn't say, I have been morally repulsed by our behavior in Vietnam. I've decided that, for us to drop plastic toys into the trees in Vietnam for the kids to grab, which blow up and send plastic shrapnel into the children, plastic so that the Vietnamese can't find it, so that it will tax their infrastructure. I have decided that our doing that and our killing millions of Vietnamese, that this is just morally outrageous and I can no longer support it. No one said that. No American elites said that, with one or two exceptions. They didn't say, even, I've decided that the deaths of American GIs are a horrendous price to pay. For them, American GIs are just chattel, right? They're one tiny step above Afghan civilians. Nobody said that. What they said was rather, essentially this. Our streets are in turmoil. The fabric of our society is being torn asunder. The next generation is being lost to us. In good conscience, I can no longer support the war. What were they saying? They were saying, I'm engaging in this war, I'm supporting this war to enhance and enlarge my economic and geopolitical agenda, my interests. But the war's effect on people in the United States is creating a movement which is threatening my economic and geopolitical interests. And it's gotten to the point where the threat has exceeded the benefit. And I no longer, in good conscience, can support the war, meaning in my own interest, in the interest of my sectors of the population, I now think it is time to stop this thing before the movements get even bigger and begin to threaten my corporation, my capital, my everything.
So to take this in a couple directions, first off, in the post-scarcity anarchism review, which will be coming out on Friday, Bookchin argues that what has been the greatest source of change hasn't been what people like maybe Marx or Trotsky argued was this great oppression that people are responding to. That hasn't been the cause for change. What has actually been the cause for change is the reality versus the possibility. So, it's not that homeless people are oppressed that will be the cause of a revolution in regards to homelessness. It's that there is homelessness while there is empty houses, and that disconnect between the easily accessible possibility and the reality is what is causing this change. And it's important to sort of dialectically think of things in these ways. So Michael Albert arguing, okay, let's look at Vietnam, for example. What actions were causing the people the elites to come come out against the war? What was their motivation? It turns out, in large part, it wasn't saying that the Vietnamese being murdered is wrong, or even that the U.S. soldiers being murdered is wrong. It was that the movement was raising costs. So if you look at it, in that way, if we wonder what kinds of things will, he's going to go on to this in just a second. So, but focus on his argument that when addressing the elites, an argument that is designed to speak truth to power, to convince the elites that they are wrong morally, it's not going to work. Trump engaging in the child detainment center things, telling him that that's wrong isn't going to work, because he knows the consequences of what he's doing, and he's doing it anyway, so he doesn't care. Instead, you have to challenge things that he does care about in order to create change. So let's watch Michael Albert argue this a little better than I just did.
That's the way that one wins change, by raising costs that coerce the results that we desire. That's the logic. It is not complicated. You don't have to read 18 volumes in arcane language to understand this. There's nothing complicated about it at all. And what does it say to us? Well, it says to us that if we want to reverse wars, if we want to run a stoplight, the social costs we have to raise aren't that high. If we want to win a higher wage, much higher costs, but still not astronomical. If we want to stop a war, if we want to get rid of the IMF, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization, much less if we want to change American infrastructure, we have to raise huge costs. That means we have to have large movements. Large movements. Not small militant movements, large militant movements. The small militant movement raises no costs at all. A movement that stays the same size, it doesn't matter how militant it gets. It is not raising costs. A movement that grows, that threatens a trajectory, that says to them, the streets are in turmoil, the next generation is lost, business as usual is impossible. That's a movement that is raising costs that begins to turn their heads. That's the kind of movement we need to build.
I do not have a source on the plastic bombs, unfortunately. I wish I did.
And these are among the things that we should talk about in discussion. I want to end so that we have some time for that. What are our prospects? Well, the first thing is that I think the war on terrorism, the massacre, on behalf of elite policies, more properly called, but the vernacular, the war on terrorism, is an inconsistent and unwise policy from their point of view. It's not surprising that they tried to seize the time, to use an expression of the left. They tried to seize the moment that September 11th offered. But there is something intrinsically weak about using the idea of a war on terrorism as an organizing principle of American foreign policy. And this is what it is. When they used the Cold War, the enemy being communism, when a president got up and said, I am pursuing policy X in Nicaragua or wherever, because of the threat and the danger of communism, he and communism were not the same thing. He and communism were very different. And when he invoked the threat of communism, he was invoking something that did not reflect badly on him, right? It was at least consistent, if not honest. When Bush gets up and says, I am engaging in an attack on Iraq in the increasing repressive reform of law in the United States, in the export of troops into the Philippines or Indonesia, in whatever the next steps are, because of terrorism, he has a problem, because terrorism is attacking civilians for political purposes, and that's what Bush does. And so he's invoking that our policy should be done because something is horrible, which he does. And I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to see this, and that over a certain period of time, people understand it. So, immediately after the bombing started, well, actually a little while after the bombing started, one of the computers at our operation, actually we work out of our house, and at our house, broke down, and we had to have somebody over to fix it. And we called, and the guy came. The guy came was about 28 or so, white guy, married, had his own business. He was the owner of this small business. So this is the archetype supporter of the rightward drift in the United States, ostensibly. This guy listens to Rush Limbaugh, also listens to NPR, doesn't boast for amusement. Rush Limbaugh is entertaining, he said. Anyway, so he's there fixing the computers, and I start to describe exactly the kinds of things that I've described to you. In the same terms, probably more emotional because of the times, I explained about delegitimating international law. He has no trouble understanding this whatsoever. I explained about maintaining credibility, using the mafia, no problem. I explained about the war, no problem. I explained about the hunger, about the motivations and everything else, and he's weeping, literally, crying. But when the whole thing is finished, he says to me, Michael, you have to understand something. I don't want to hear this from you. My wife doesn't want to hear this from you. My friends don't want to hear this from you. My parents don't want to hear this from you. And I say to him, you mean like you don't want somebody to describe to you the pain and suffering of an earthquake? And he says to me, exactly. You might not have all gotten the analogy, but he got it immediately. What he was saying was, and he now said it explicitly, I can't do anything. I can't impact it. It is a fact of life. It's the way the world is. It is just reality. I have to try and make my situation, the situation of my wife, the situation of my kids, the situation of my friends better. For me to concern myself and to worry about this simply detracts from that to no good. I was recently in Brazil for the World Social Forum. It was a massive event. We went from venue to venue by cab. You had to. That meant taking lots and lots of cabs. During the course of that, we asked every cab driver. It was like a controlled experiment, the same question over and over again. You may not know too much about Brazil, but very briefly, in Brazil, there's something called the Workers' Party, the PT. Lula runs. He's going to run in October, I think it is, for president again. This is a very, very, very progressive force. Call it social democratic if you want, call it left if you want. It isn't entirely clear. It is so far to the left of any significant social manifestation in the world that it is very, very important. We asked each cab driver, what do you think of the PT? Nothing much. What do you think of voting? Don't do it. What do you think of Lula? I like him. He's a really good guy. I sort of trust him and respect him. Lula is a very impressive.
This is before
working-class
Bolsonaro,
organizer
obviously.
Running for president. Are you going to vote for Lula? No. Why? The most eloquent response was, because we're dust blowing in the wind. In other words, because it doesn't matter. Because poverty, indignity, subordination are like gravity. They're like aging. They are a fact of life. Don't whine about it. Get on with things. That's the biggest obstacle, I think, to organizing the scale and reach and strength of movement that we need, whether we're talking about Brazil or the United States or pretty much other places in the world.
So, I'm going to let you folks in on a little tiny secret. Shh, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone what I'm about to tell you. But I have, hopefully you folks have been watching or at least aware of a little podcast called Revolution Z, which Michael Albert runs. But I have been emailing with Destiny and with Faraday Speaks and with American Johnson of Non-Compete. And rumor has it, at some point in our future, we will be wonderfully treated to a discussion on economics between Michael Albert and Destiny, and perhaps as well, I believe sometime next month, a discussion between Michael Albert and American Johnson in regards to political vision and how to create change, which is about to be the topic of discussion at this point in the lecture. So, shh, don't tell anyone, but that's going to be awesome. All right, let's keep watching Michael Albert talk about how to make change in the world.
It's a feeling that oppression is bad, sure. We keep telling people how bad it is. They know. They know. The poor know that poverty is painful. The people who suffer racism know that racism is undignified and degrading. The people who get raped and beaten know that that's horrible. 30 years ago, when we explained these things, when movements explained and surfaced these things, it was actually a revelation, which is why the New Left swelled up as it did. But it's no longer a revelation. Now everybody knows. What people don't believe is that there's any alternative. So when I talk about prospects, I have to suggest that our prospects depend on two very important things. Three things. One is conveying alternatives, conveying a convincing, compelling vision, not just of a short-term program, but of what we really want as an alternative. Why not just a short-term program? Because for 35 years, we've been telling people capitalism is this powerful system. It emanates forces that contour and impact all sides of life. Ditto for patriarchy, ditto for racism, ditto for authoritarianism. These structures are powerful. They control and rein in any efforts at change. They subvert efforts to make things better. And you know what? People believe us. People have learned this lesson. And they think that, just to give one example, globalization, they think that, if you guys were to win, if you guys were to replace the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, with new international organizations, which instead of being devoted to tilting the playing field on behalf of the rich and powerful, were devoted to tilting the playing field on behalf of the poor and weak, and that's actually what the anti-globalization movement is about, precisely. If you were to do that, you know what? The economy of the United States would still be the same as it was before, and the economy of Britain, and the economy of India, and South Africa, and Australia, and on and on. And the forces from all those economies, which produced the IMF and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization before, would be operative again. And slowly but surely, they would undo what you did. That's actually not wrong. That's correct. If you're not moving forward, you're going to move backward. If we win changes and they are not moving forward toward new and larger changes, towards ever greater changes, towards systemic change, then they will be moving backward toward the old relations. So, what we have to do is provide a vision of where we're going and a compelling picture of the process by which fighting for and winning changes, reforms, like an end to a war, that's a reform, an end to the IMF, that's a reform, a shorter work week, that's a reform, affirmative action, that's a reform, a picture, an image, an understanding of how fighting for those things can be done in a way which leaves us more empowered after we do it, which leaves us structurally stronger after we do it, and which leaves us desiring and in a position to win still more instead of rolling back to where we came from, and which tells where we're going. When we achieve those two things, we will be 2/3 of the way, I think, toward having the basis for movements that can really turn around the planet. The third problem is one, I usually talk about a whole array of problems.
This next one's really important.
We only reach people who are looking for...
For those talking about destiny in the chat and stuff, maybe this one's important. Let's think about it.
But the one that of late has seemed to me to be most overwhelming...
And for those mad at Contra or whatever else.
...is the following. One day I asked myself, not that long ago, I was at an event like this, I was speaking, somebody was talking about stuff, somebody said something which caused me, sitting on the panel, to think in this direction. I thought to myself, how many people in the last 30 years have been in the vicinity of the left? By that I mean, how many people have been in a movement?
All right, so folks might recognize this quote from, I believe I use it again in the Post-Scarcity Anarchism review, which comes out Friday. But I've used this quote in a couple videos, and even Re-Education, Aaron of Re-Education used it in a video. I believe Angie Speaks used it in a video. This next point, again, for people thinking about cancel culture and stuff, and the left being like this this beehive that outsiders, wouldn't dream to step into. I think that this argument is very important.
Anti-war, women's movement, gay and lesbian movement, labor movement, no nukes movement, Mideast, anything, any progressive or left movement, or been in a class for a whole semester with a radical or a revolutionary, or otherwise been in the vicinity of the left, in some way engaged with the left. And I decided that 10 million was a really conservative number. And then I thought to myself, the left is supposed to be the good guys. We're supposed to have better morals. We're supposed to care about one another. We're supposed to be the repository of the future, the place from which sympathy and empathy and caring and solidarity emerges in society. So shouldn't it be the case that if you come into the vicinity of the left, you are attracted ever more strongly to it, that it's desirable, that it's appealing, that it is fulfilling, that it is empowering? Shouldn't it be the case, therefore, that people who come into the vicinity of it become more strongly engaged with it, more and more committed, more and more conscious, more and more involved? That should seem to me to characterize a healthy, powerful, growing, effective left. Really, it should characterize any left. But if 10 million people over the last 35 years have come into the vicinity of the left, and if the great bulk of them were made ever more firmly involved in the left and committed to the left, and if they were outreaching to others, then by this time we would probably have a left with 40 or 50 million people in the United States. And at that point, I almost fell off my chair on the stage, because I realized that the stickiness problem, which is what I call it, the fact that we aren't sticky, that the left, instead of attracting people, like gravitationally, and having them stick, almost repulses people. The fact that we aren't sticky is responsible for the fact that right now we have, instead of 40 million people, whatever we do have. And just think of what it would be, what the world would be, and how many lives would be saved, and how many souls would be brighter if we had an American left with 40 million people right now. This is my generation's fault, I'm sad to say. But the problem is, and the third key component among others, is to build a movement which actually makes people feel better, stronger, more committed, rather than wanting to leave. We can talk about this in the discussion period. The essence of it is simple. We say to people, come join us. Risk your relations with your parents, risk your relations with some friends, risk your future job, no longer enjoy television, no longer enjoy movies, no longer be able to conduct yourself freely and in a relaxed fashion because everybody's going to criticize everything that you do. You may well have a less emotional engagements, less deep friendships than before. It's distinctly possible. Come join us. And what will we give you for all of that? Long meetings and backbiting. and a set of standards by which you feel that every time you try and do something, you fail. And we wonder why we're not growing.
All right, let's think about that again, right? Us on the left, the people that are on the right side of things in the world, the correct interpretation of what's going on, that racism, sexism, classism, and stuff are bad, that capitalism sucks. We tell people, hey, come join us. It's going to be super awesome. We're really fun. I talk about this in the post-scarcity anarchism review, that we say, okay, come join us. It's going to be awesome. Oh, by the way, like, everything you liked is actually bad and problematic. Anything you try is, like, not going to be good enough. And all your takes, like, won't stand up to our purity tests. Okay. That's a problem, right? I don't think any reasonable person would want to join such a movement, unfortunately. So that's a problem. We got to fix it. We got to fix that.
We need to rethink what it means to create a left that is sticky and that grows and that can raise social costs capable of changing society in the short run and in the long run. I think if we do those things, we will be in very good shape. I think that the shape where, there's a lot of people who like to look back and not find problems. I like to look back and at the present and find huge numbers of problems. If we look and we see no problems, we're in very deep trouble. The next generation is not going to be genetically superior to my generation. They're not going to be smarter. It's not going to be more courageous. It's either going to do things better or it's going to do things the same and do no better. So it has to be possible to do things better. So I need to be able to go back and look at what my generation did and what has been done since and find flaws. And we need to not wallow in those flaws but correct them. The big flaws that I see is a lack of attention to vision, a lack of willingness to try and sit down and answer the question, what do you want, which virtually everybody asks, a lack of attention to strategy, to developing a picture of how change comes about that's compelling and convincing, and a lack of attention to our own needs, to creating a movement that sustains and keeps us. And if we can deal with those three things, then I think the war on terrorism is doomed, and so is capitalism. Thank you.
All right, awesome. So one more down. Maybe the last one, unless we decide we want to watch the Michael Prenti one as well. But the Michael Prenti one is the other long one. So this is Mike Rupert. I don't know that much about Mike Rupert. I think that maybe some of his stuff gets a little conspiracy theory-esque, but I do think I tried to give us some very different flavors here. So we've got, Ward Churchill's take that 9/11 was deserved, and maybe we should look at that as like some sort of tactic to analyze in a more positive light than to condemn. We got Michael Albert talking about looking at the response to 9/11 as demonstrating the way in which the U.S. elite don't care about people in the U.S. or people in the third world, and looking at how the left should challenge that with growing movements and using institutions that exist like the World Court. And now we're going to have Mike Rupert, who kind of dives a little bit more into the brick and mortar sense of the September 11th attacks. Not quite the planes were actually holograms, or the planes were actually bombs designed to look like planes. None of that nonsense. But he is going to look a little more at the attack itself specifically. So let's see what Mike Rupert is all about.
Our next speaker is going to be Mike Rupert, and he's going to be, hooray, we got some fans, all right.
I do wish I had the video for this lecture, but it doesn't exist that I could find.
What didn't happen on 9/11. Mike, of course, is the former LAPD cop who blew the whistle on CIA drug smuggling into Los Angeles, and as a result got forced to resign, or got fired, depending on how you look at it, and has been chasing after the truth ever since. He's got a tremendous newsletter called From the Wilderness, and if you want to visit his website, fromthewilderness.com, you can become a subscriber and a supporter of Mike's. I think you'll find him one of the most colorful 911 presenters that we have. And without further ado, please help me welcome Mike Rupert.
This, by the way, is from the International Inquiry into the 9/11 Cover-Up, is what this was called, as seen in the title. Actually, a bunch of different speakers talked at this debate. I think it was a multi-day debate as well, and I have all of the lectures. I just find this one like the most. I like this one particularly, so it's the one that I selected. But I think like TUC Radio, Time of Useful Consciousness Radio, put out this whole thing. So if you find this particular lecture interesting, you can look up the International Inquiry into the 9/11 cover-up and see what other speakers spoke at that event. But let's see what Mike Rupert has to say.
Hi, everybody. Are we having fun? And we only have I'm going to talk for 30 minutes, and do you realize that in 34 lectures in 8 countries, I have never spoken for 30 minutes? That's good news and the bad news. The good news is that I don't have to talk for 3 hours about what I'm going to talk about tonight. 9/11 is something that is so intense, but it doesn't need to be overcomplicated. And what I'm going to do for you tonight is to make the exact same presentation I would make if I were a detective.
I guess we're watching this in real time.
On strictly the issue of the FAA and NORAD.
That's right. It's fairly quick.
On September the 11th. And you know what? What's so beautiful about this is that it doesn't have to be overly complicated. As a matter of fact, it's so simple, it's scary. As a matter of fact, it's so simple, it may help you to understand why the rest of the world doesn't seem to want to get 9/11, or why the rest of the world doesn't want to deal with 9/11, because there was an old commercial that I used to like in the 1970s for Burger King with a young star named Rodney Allen Rippey. And they handed this young, he was like a 4-year-old boy at the time, a big Whopper, and he picked it up and said, "It's too big to eat." And for many people, 9/11 is too big to eat. But to understand the fact, and let me not mince words here, that 9/11 was not only premeditated, was not only, thank you guys, facilitated, thank you, God, these guys are good, was not only facilitated by the Bush administration were in fact criminal accomplices, equally guilty of murder with anyone else who participated in those attacks, period. Now, if we can just get the, yeah, we did it. Okay, we're in the slideshow mode. Now, very briefly, just to give you an overview.
I wish I had these slides.
Many people wonder about how such a quote-unquote conspiracy could be carried out. They say, oh,
There's that better.
thousands of people would have had to know. The answer is no. How many people in the room have ever participated in a covert operation? One. I have, unwittingly. That's the one that led me to resign from LAPD when I saw that CIA was bringing drugs into the country, and I was asked to become a part of it. I have studied a great many covert operations. I have interviewed a great many covert operatives, and the fact is, you don't need a whole lot of people to know. You need key people in key places. For the first reason, that there's something called compartmentalization, where you only have a person in one room working on a bolt, a person in another room working on a nut, a person in another room working on a screw, and nobody knows what the finished product looks like. That's metaphors for covert operations. But also, you only need a few people in key places. One of the stories that From the Wilderness has broken and will continue to break, and which will appear in a book which I will have out this year. We're probably going to change the title of the book to match our video, The Truth and Lies of 9/11. But we identified in the FBI a man named David Frasca. Now, somebody lend me this. There, David Frasca. The FBI's Radical Fundamentalist Unit at FBI headquarters, who single-handedly suppressed 5 separate investigations, each one of which could have prevented the attacks of 9/11. One of which was the suspension of an investigation into of Osama bin Laden's relatives, Abdullah and Omar. That was the story broken by Greg Palast at BBC. The second was the Chicago agent, Robert Wright, who was he gave a chilling press conference at the National Press Club in tears, where he apologized to the 9/11 families. He had penetrated Al-Qaeda financing. The next was, of course, the Phoenix memo by Special Agent Ken Williams. You might recall when that came out in 2002, which talked about, gee, there's all these Arab fundamentalist guys taking flight training lessons. Don't you think we might want to check other flight schools around the country? And David Frasca's decision was to suppress that request and suspend all investigations, saying they didn't have time, when you can go on the web and get a list of all the flight schools. Of course, there was the Colleen Rowley case, Time Magazine's Woman of the Year, the FBI agent in Minneapolis investigating Zacharias Moussaoui, Frasca's behavior was so brutal it caused her to write an 18-page memorandum much of which I have quoted in my book, which describes deliberate, willful, malicious actions, not acts of neglect. And then finally, the accidental or intentional destruction of all kinds of carnivore email intercepts out of the Denver office, all of which was ordered by the Radical Fundamentalist Unit headed by Dave Frasca, again, which had those emails been pursued instead of destroyed, could have prevented the attacks at 9/11. What happened to him? He got promoted after 9/11. I owe a great debt as we go through what we're doing here tonight to two people, two of my dear friends and very respected colleagues, one of whom I just got to meet tonight for the first time. But Nafiz I have met before. Nafiz Ahmed, author of The War on Freedom, who provided some of this research that I'm about to show you, and the other is Paul Thompson, who has the most incredible timeline. I mean, I started this little timeline called Oh Lucy, which caused a lot of people to attack me right after 9/11, but I started exposing things, and it was very successful. It was taken from Lucy Arnaz. Oh, Lucy, you got a lot of explaining to do. And that's where I got the title for that. Paul Thompson's timeline is the sine qua non of 9/11 research. His website is cooperativeresearch.org, and I thank both of these fine gentlemen for the work that they have done. Yeah, they deserve it. All right, now is Phil Berg here? Yeah, there you are. All right, you're the DA, and I'm the dick, as we call them in police terms, coming in to make a case. Here's the law. Consider that an aircraft, this is from the FAA Operations Manual, consider that an aircraft emergency exists when there is an unexpected loss of radar contact and radio communications with any aircraft. Elsewhere, the FAA states emergency determinations under a section called emergency determinations. If you are in doubt that a situation constitutes an emergency or potential emergency, handle it as though it were an emergency. No equivocation in language there. Aircraft goes off course, they don't answer the radio, they deviate in any way, shape, or form. If these conditions exist, you can't get a response. If this says clearly, you shall treat it as an emergency.
So I think folks maybe looking at something like the Epstein stuff can kind of benefit from this style of analysis. Essentially, he's laying it out in a way, like he says, where if he was to put this incident on trial and engage with it, in a legal sort of way. I don't really remember if he'd said that part yet or if it's still coming up. But, if you look at like the Epstein thing, why were these various obvious failures, allowed to take place all along the way? Why was he, initially arrested and allowed to go home constantly? Why was he his suicide watch allowed to be lifted? Why was he in a position where he was able to commit suicide, if that, obviously if that even is what took place? So these kind of basic questions is what Mike Ruppert is going to do in regards to 9/11.
In the next slide, we talk about Payne Stewart, and Payne Stewart, most of you are familiar with. He was leaving Florida, flying to Dallas, Learjet. Massive explosive decompression at 35,000 feet. Everybody dies. The reason why that happened, by the way, was because they had a chest with dry ice on board that wasn't supposed to be there, which affected the pressure in the cabin. Air Force fighter jets were scrambled and flying alongside the Payne Stewart plane within minutes. And this is a quote from stories about that, and Nafiz caught it. Pilots are supposed to hit each fix with pinpoint accuracy. If a plane deviates by 15 degrees or 2 miles from that course, the flight controllers will hit the panic button. They'll call the plane saying, American 11, you're deviating from course. It's considered a real emergency, like a police car screeching down a highway at 100 miles an hour. When Golfer Payne Stewart's incapacitated Learjet missed a turn at a fix heading north instead of west to Texas, F-16 interceptors were quickly dispatched. Indeed, listen to this, the U.S. military has their own radar network, NORAD. They are tied to the FAA computer in order to get information on incoming flights. If a target is discovered without a flight plan or information, or in violation of the same, they will call on the shout line to the appropriate ATC, Air Traffic Control Center, for an ID. If the center sector has no data block or other information on it, the military will usually scramble an intercept flight, and they will likely find 2 F-18s on their tail within 10 or so minutes. Close quote.
2 F-18s on their tail in 10 minutes. Keep that in mind.
And Air National Guard fighter jets were scrambled 67 times on a routine basis under these circumstances and were flying beside the designated target within a matter of minutes, usually less than a half an hour, but the scramble order was issued immediately according to the book. Now, I left some things backstage, and maybe I can ask backstage, there are some papers that I left back there, because I'm going to need to refer to some footnotes. If somebody could grab those maybe and bring them out to me before we get into this. Now, let's look at this thing I call pulling the trigger. This is from a 1998 FAA Executive Order number 760.4J, effective November 3, 1998. It's on the website. That's the website listing. According to FAA regulations, it is the FAA hijack coordinator who issues all requests for the military to provide interceptions and escorts. And no, there's a whole stack of papers back there on the sofa that has footnotes in them I'm going to need. It is to provide interceptors and escorts, and the hijack coordinator will do so, quote, by direct contact with the National Military Command Center. That's in the Pentagon. Now, there was some misinformation spun after 9/11 because we had planes hijacked out of New York, Boston, and Dulles. That's the ones, thank you. Gee, there was some confusion, but what we see here is that at NORAD headquarters, which are in Colorado, there's only one guy who sits on the trigger, just like we saw with Dave Frasca for all of the hijacked airliners on 9/11. His instructions are brutally clear. There is no leeway for his choice in the matter as to what his options are when certain conditions exist. And here's another quote that from the Associated Press on August 13th. Fighter jets scrambled 67 times properly in the calendar year prior to 9/11. Now, this is a chart that I will be publishing in my book, and for members of the press only, because I only have 15 copies. I have this chart, which is fully footnoted, and you will see up here on the screen that I have a little footnote beside each one.
This is why I wish that I had video of this lecture, but I couldn't for the life of me find some video to correspond with it. The lecture, as I have it, is just an MP3 because it's from a radio station. But when I was looking up this international inquiry into the 9/11 cover-up thing, I could not find video. I imagine it exists, but I wasn't able to find it, unfortunately.
Which gives you the source from where I got the information. And we're going to go through this timeline now, exactly as I would do if I was in court, because it's according to this timeline that I can ask questions of witnesses under direct examination. If this happened at this time, what did you do then? And if you did not follow the procedure, why did you not follow the procedure? It is a cut and dried case of direct examination, or if I were a detective, what I would say to a suspect or possible suspect or person of interest in the case. But we go, and you probably can't see this, so I'm going to have to read them quickly, but we're going to go through this. The morning of September the 11th, 8:13. Last routine contact with Flight 11. Immediately thereafter, the pilot fails to respond to a call to climb to a new altitude. Flight 11 took off at 7:59. Source for that, Boston Globe. 8:13, Flight 11 hijacked. Source for that, item number 2. That comes from the Nashua Telegraph. It's also on the NORAD timeline. 8:14, pilot, Flight 11 activates talkback button. Controller can hear conversation in the cockpit. Every commercial airliner has a series of 3 buttons on the control yoke. I may miss up the frequencies. I think it's 7400, 7500, 7600, which are called the IFF, identify friend or foe buttons. One is in-flight emergency, one is hijack, and there's another one for some other emergency. The hijack button was activated on the control yoke, which allows controllers to hear conversations in the cockpit. That source is from Christian Science Monitor. There's a real fine conspiracy theory paper. September 13th, 2003. So we know from these events right now that at this point that at between 8:13 and 8:14 a.m. in the morning, we have confirmation, according to what the FAA would know, that Flight 11 had been hijacked.
I didn't mention this during the Ward Churchill lecture, I don't believe. I think I'd forgotten. But when he mentions the $30 worth of box cutters, I feel like box cutters, kind of like the, they found the passports, and like, well, that seems unlikely that they would find passports like in the rubble. I think that the, not that it necessarily matters, but I think that the box knife excuse was invalid. I was talking to a friend who had worked for airlines, saying that a lot of these like long distance pilots and stuff are retired, military for one thing, not the type of person you would want to mess with or whatever. But I also just think that box knives being like a very small, inconspicuous weapon was the go-to excuse. I don't know. I don't really have an idea of what maybe they really had, whether it's, I don't know, a bomb or a gun or a sword. I don't freaking know. I just think that the box knives as the weapon used seems unlikely to me. Seems like something that they would lie about. I don't know.
Period. There is no question. At that point, immediately, the scramble order should have been issued. That's the horizontal line that I have on the chart right up here. Now we're going to look at some delays. 8:20, Flight 11 stops transmitting IFF beacon, confirming that it had been activated. In other words, we now know from another source that if the IFF beacon was turned off, that it must have been turned on. NORAD definitely should have been notified. We have more confirmation. 8:20, Flight 11 veers dramatically off course, AM. FAA absolutely should have been notified. We have now 2 or more conditions existing. 8:20, Boston Air Traffic Control decides that Flight 11 is a hijack. Official timeline shows other ATCs are not notified for 5 minutes. That didn't happen 67 times in the calendar year prior to 9/11. Why were they not notified? At 8:20, Flight 77 departs Dulles Airport in Virginia. At 8:24, the pilot of Flight 11 activates the talk button. Boston Air Traffic Control overhears hijackers. The transponder has been off now for 10 minutes. 10 minutes since the point in time at which it was mandatory for the scramble order to have been issued. 8:25, Boston Air Traffic Control notifies other ATCs that flight is hijacking. They don't notify NORAD yet for another 13 minutes. Now, if I had the witness on the stand, and I will show you who the witness is before we're done tonight, the question would be, wait a minute, 67 times this happened in the year prior to 9/11. Now, you're telling me on 9/11 you have a confirmed hijacking, the first in recent history, and yet you waited 13 minutes after you knew, but then you already knew back at 8:14 that it was a hijack. Why did you not, for this 11 minutes here, notify anybody that anything was going on? If we come down to 8:28, Boston Air Traffic Control sees Flight 11 make a 100-degree turn to the south. Air traffic controls confirm they never lost sight of Flight 11. They never lost sight of Flight 11. Now, one thing I'll tell you, I don't think I have the slide in here. It is an absolute lie, and I think I may have it later on. The government has said, gee, when we lost the transponder, we couldn't pick them out of all the other airplanes in the sky. That is not true. We have complete conflicting testimony from FAA people and from pilots showing not only does that highlight the aircraft on every screen in every region, but we know that the Department of Defense, the NORAD radar, separate, has a skin paint capability capable of determining altitude. So nobody ever lost track of anything at any time on 9/11. Boston ATC sees Flight 11 make a 100-degree turn to the south. ATCs confirm they never lost sight of Flight 11. Press accounts confirm that Flight 11's radar dot has been tagged for easy visibility. That means it was on every screen in the region. Even that the plane was being watched by American Airlines headquarters, believe it or not. These contradict the Washington Post story saying that the Boston authorities had lost contact. It's very important to give you the source for that. So I will go back here and say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, that's the Washington Post, September the 12th. We come down to 8:30. Now, we know that we have a confirmed hijacking in progress. Flight 11 has been hijacked. It's off course. It's lost control. It's a national emergency. And what is President Bush doing? President Bush's motorcade leaves his Florida hotel for the Emma Booker Elementary School 9 miles away. The journey takes an incredible 25 minutes to go 9 miles. As Bush is leaving, he is asked by a reporter, quote, "Do you know what's going on in New York?" Bush says, he does. Source, 13, maybe good for Bush. ABC News, September 11th, 2001. It's amazing what happens when you get on these things right as they happen. 8:37, Sector Air Traffic Control asks pilot of Flight 175 to look for a lost plane. Huh? The plane is not lost. Pilot of 175 says they can see Flight 11 and are told to keep away. 8:40, Boston Air Traffic Control notifies NORAD of Flight 11 hijacking. Wait a minute, it's been 26 minutes now. We're talking about this line right here. 26 minutes. Since we knew that it was a hijacking, since NORAD, according to their own procedural manual, would have known it was a hijacking, and yet we have a 26-minute delay before the air traffic control notifies NORAD, which is where the one guy who pulls the trigger for scramble is sitting. Why did that happen? Good question. Somebody needs to ask it. We come right down to 8:40. Two pilots at Otis Air Force Base at Cape Cod are told of the hijack, yet no scramble order is given. What? It happened 67 times in the year prior. Source for that, number 16, is the Cape Cod Times, August 21st. They went right out to the air base. 8:42, Flight 93 takes off from Newark after a 40-minute delay. That's kind of interesting. That's right here. 8:42, Flight 175 veers off course. According to the FAA manual, if you have any doubt, you shall assume and proceed as if it was an emergency. 8:42, an air traffic control says, looks like he's heading southbound, but there's no transponder, no nothing. Now from another press report, which is from the New York Times on October 16th, we have a plane off course and no transponder. Now, under FAA rules and procedures, it is axiomatically an emergency and a hijacking. A second set of scramble orders should be given, so we know that the Flight 175 hijacking is confirmed at 8:42. At 8:43, NORAD is notified of the 175 hijack. 8:43. Gee, that's just like a minute later. Now, why did they wait so long for one, do the second one immediately? But listen to this. Over here on the right, it says, at 8:46, scramble orders are issued at Otis Air Force Base to go after Flight 11, 190 miles away. Fighters from closer bases like Atlantic City are not scrambled. 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 impacts World Trade Center. 8:46, acting chief of the, typo in here, Acting Joint Chiefs Chairman Richard Myers claims that he sees a TV report about the plane hitting. Now, didn't we just hear in the FAA procedural manual that the FAA hijack coordinator, now we have seen a scramble order issued very late, is to do this with the National Military Command Center, which is in the Pentagon, which reports directly to the Joint Chiefs. And General Richard Myers claims he did not know that two airplanes had been hijacked at 8:46 in the morning. Thank you. The procedural manual says he certainly knew. 8:46, Flight 175 stops emitting a transponder signal 50 miles north of New York City. Other reports state that 175 had turned off its transponder, then back on again and on an unassigned frequency. There is no doubt now that we have an emergency under any circumstances. Over here at 8:46, 3 F-16s assigned to Andrew Air Force Base are flying air-to-ground strike training mission 200 miles from Washington. Instead of being ordered to D.C. at supersonic speeds, they return to base, slowly landing only after Flight 77 hits the Pentagon. They could have been in D.C. airspace within 10 minutes. 8:46, Flight 77 is reported by ATCs to be severely off course. 3 scrambles. After 8:46, National Military Command Center's officials in the eastern part of the Pentagon are talking to law enforcement officials about possible responses. What? The responses are already dictated for them in their manuals. You shall scramble fighters immediately. Now we have a report saying they were debating whether to, there was no leeway. They're debating when it's before them in black and white what it was they were supposed to do. That is, at best, civilly, a civil negligence suit of the utmost extreme. Of course, we believe it's criminal, and I agree that the RICO suit should put all those people in jail once we find out who they are, and we'll get there. All right.
So what he's talking about, and unfortunately we can't see the timeline that he's looking at, but that in 67 times prior, there have been planes that go off course for whatever reason. Their radio, breaks, they lose communication, something in the radar, and they end up, it's like if they're going like a mile or two off course, then jets are scrambled. They have all these procedures in place that go off without a hitch in what's called an emergency situation. And these things are supposed to take place within, the first 10 minutes. And here we have in this timeline, a half hour or whatever is going by, and all these situations similar to, I keep bringing up the Epstein thing, but I see parallels between this and the Epstein thing where, this guy is arrested, yet he's frequently allowed to go back to his mansion to do who knows what. He's put on suicide watch, but then he's not being watched. He's somehow, if you're in an empty room, it's kind of hard to take yourself out. He's somehow able to take himself out if that is indeed what he did. There seems to be a lot of any one of these mistakes is suspicious enough, but when you lay them all out on paper, all these mistakes, it looks very peculiar. And so that's basically what Rupert here is talking about, is that there's all these systems in place to protect us from this kind of situation, and yet again and again and again throughout the timeline, procedures weren't done. Why is that?
I could have said something not quite as nice as putting them in jail, but that's all right. Flight 77 is reported off course. We come to 846. Okay, so they're talking about what to do next at 846. After 846, the FAA has an open line to the Secret Service. They can't manage to follow their own procedures, but they're talking directly to the Secret Service in the White House. It's confirmed by Vice President Cheney. I'll just tell you the source on that real quick, because already I see I'm running out of time. That was NBC News, right after the attacks. After 846, the NORAD and National Military Command Center have open phone lines. 846 to 9, Navy Captain Deborah Lauer in the Bush motorcade receives a message from the White House Situation Room about the first impact. This is before Bush even walks into. But notice that we already have 3 confirmed hijackings. Yet he decided to go into the room to read to the kids. Why? Probably so he could give a plausibly acceptable denial as to why he couldn't issue the order to shoot the planes down, because he knew that they had to have the attacks. Bush later stated, that, of course, that he saw the video of the attacks and said, "Oh boy, that's a terrible pilot." Well, of course, the video wasn't played for hours of the first crash. 846, Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General, calls her husband at Justice Department. He calls the Justice Department Command Center and advises of a hijacking. Now, wait a minute. We got the Solicitor General getting a cell phone call, calling the Justice Department saying there's a hijacking, and yet FAA has not issued scramble orders for all 3 flights. Somebody needs to go to jail. 846. First TV and news reports of the plane crashing into the World Trade Center. This is the latest time that Bush over here could have known, been asked by events by a reporter at his hotel when he indicated that he already knew. 850, last radio contact with Flight 77. Pilot asks for clearance to a higher altitude, then does not respond to a routine instruction. Otis Air National Guard orders pilots take off 12 minutes after receiving notification. That's nonsense. Flying their F-15s at top speed, 1,875 miles an hour with a supersonic cruise speed of 1,600 miles an hour. If you do the math on the ones that went to the Pentagon, they had to have been flying at 300 miles an hour on this Rush national emergency. 855, Flight 77 turns around. More confirmation. I mean, there's no doubt what's going on, but watch these delays that come down here when NORAD and the FAA did not do what it was they were supposed to do. I go through a lot of stuff which we apparently will not have time to do tonight. I'm sorry. A news photographer traveling with Bush entourage overhears a radio transmission that Press Secretary Ari Fleischer would be needed on arrival to discuss reports of the crash. That's before 858. Latest confirmed arrival of Bush at the Booker Elementary School, 41. We got 3 confirmed hijackings in place, and he knows about it. And he has not lifted a finger to get anything up in the air. He has not mobilized the military. No executive orders have been issued from the White House, not from Dick Cheney, not from the National Command Authority. Bush is taken to a holding room and briefed by Condi Rice. Boy, there's a woman we can really distrust. taken to a holding room and briefed, yet he decided to go ahead and read. 9:01, the pilots of Flight 93 acknowledge a general FAA warning. Now the FAA is issuing warnings about cockpit intrusion. Duh. Request to barricade doors. The pilots are not told of the WTC crash. Now I'm using a lot of stuff from the NORAD and FAA timelines, actually. At this time, Bush cannot be approached because he's in the discussions. Flight 17 hits Tower 2 of World Trade Center. This has all happened before the second plane hits the World Trade Center. Now I'm using the government records, ABC News, mainstream news, NORAD, FAA timelines. All you got to do is lay this out and look at it. By 9:05, West Virginia ATCs notice an eastbound plane with no transponder entering their airspace. It's Flight 77, right there. All ATC facilities nationwide are notified that the Flight 11 crash was probably a hijacking. Yet the West Virginia ATCs do not notify NORAD that Flight 77 is off course for 18 minutes. Why not? FAA informs NORAD at 9:16 that Flight 93 may have been hijacked. Duh. Look at this. By the book, all fighter aircraft should have been scrambled by this time, and we still have delay after delay after delay. One Air Force pilot at 9:24, codenamed Honey, who piloted an F-16 from Langley, disputes the official version. He says that the call to battle stations was not sounded until 9:24. In other words, even some of the pilots were disagreeing because they can't keep their cover up straight. From 9:27 through 9:30, I got 2 minutes left, boys. Bush talks to Cheney at the White House, but there is no discussion of shooting down Flight 77 or Flight 93. Why? Bush finally leaves Booker at 9:29, and at 9:30, transponder contact on Flight 93 is lost. We come to the next page, 9:32, Flight 77 does that wonderful, what Kristen Breitweiser said, the loop-de-loop over the Pentagon. I love that terminology when she testified, God bless her. And amazing how you learn how to do that with 4 or 5 flight lessons. Dives into the side of the Pentagon, which is under construction. At the same time, the Flight 93 hijacking is confirmed. Now, I won't have time to go through all of this, but I will tell you, and I spoke to Phil Berg today, and he and I are both in complete agreement that Flight 93 was shot down. You cannot have a 5-mile or 4 or 5-mile debris trail. I think the port engine was something like 2.5 miles from the impact site. These multi-ton engines don't bounce 2.5 miles. Multiple witnesses confirm a missile strike on the aircraft, and there were some very strange military planes around that. So when you get to the bottom of all this, nobody did what they were supposed to be doing, and it shows very clear criminally negligent at best behavior. I think you have a clear case for conspiracy here. Now, one thing that's very important, and I'll try to speak like the Federal Express guy here, because I just don't know how to do this in 25 minutes. There was, on September 11th, an operation called Vigilant Guardian underway. And this is a story which was pulled from LexisNexis, and I give credit to Barbara Honegger. I don't think that she has been here. Where are you? Well, stand up. There you are. Barb broke this story, which is indeed perhaps perfect camouflage in a way to discredit, or excuse me, to distract air operations commands and behavior, in some cases by inserting false blips on radar screen, by saying we're going to have some planned hijackings, and isn't it convenient that this was scheduled to happen on 9/11? It's one way to have confused the air response system so that people would have behaved in a way just to give enough time. But the air traffic controllers have no excuse for not responding according to textbook procedures on September 11th with all of the maneuvers of the aircraft which I identified. They were not part of the exercise. If they don't respond, you still have commercial air traffic out there. Now, as I look through this, the key point that Nafiz brought up was that there was one guy who pulls the trigger for fighter scrambles. That's him, Ben Sliney, or Slinny. His first day on the job, September 11th. He has never testified in public anywhere. He did testify in a closed session in Congress. USA Today has a wonderful little clip of him on their website. You can't find it unless you found it. I found it. I've saved it on PDF, but I couldn't save it to an image. I was going to show it and play it, where he talks about clearing the air traffic all around these hijacked flights and opening the doors, and it was called To and Through, and I'll send the link to the right people at the time. But, you know, if I was a detective, and even though my nickname when I was with LAPD was Inspector Clouseau, even I would have been smart enough to know that Ben Slenny is the first guy you got to talk to about what happened with the fighters. Have we heard a word from Ben Slenny anywhere? Has he been called to testify before the independent 9/11 Commission? No, he has testified before a closed hearing, a session of the Joint House-Senate Intelligence Committee. The families, God bless them, of the 9/11 Steering Committee have asked a whole list of questions. But it doesn't have to be much more complicated than that as we proceed from here, because we are all nearing a very close window of opportunity to either make 9/11 into an issue that breaks the whole world situation open, or seeing it pass into the dusty archives of history to be discussed like the events of November 22nd, 1963. Our window, one second, I'll come back to you. Our window is now in the course of the hearings. Our window is, and I will talk about this in more detail tomorrow night, the Supreme Court decision pending upon the secret records of the National Energy Policy Development Group, which is where the motive for 9/11 lies. The deepest secrets of 9/11 lie in that task force. It lies when the Commission's final report is released sometime, I believe it's in late July or August, and certainly it will close forever by the presidential election of this November. My plea to all 9/11 activists is that we have to find the sheet music so that we can all sing the same notes. I would submit to you that if I could make this case to you in 20 minutes, we can make the same case to the American people in 20 minutes, and if we keep it simple, we might be able to crack the nut that we need to crack, that we must crack to save our country, to save our planet, and our civilization. Thank you very much.
That was Michael.
Save our
independent
civilization, huh? It's a little dog whistly there. No, just kidding. So the Michael Parenti lecture is probably, we're gonna skip this, to be honest. It's an hour long. I'm gonna upload it with the other ones when that time comes. So instead, for now, let me, oops, what am I doing here? Whoop. Cool. So what I don't really want to go through the Michael Parenti lecture on account of it's like an hour long and we're already 3 hours in. So instead, let's switch gears here, and maybe just for like another 10-20 minutes, I can answer some questions, answer any questions you all have, and we'll call it a day. I think that's what we should do. And then I'm gonna, after this stream, I'm gonna make all those lectures public instead of private, and I'm going to put them into my lecture playlist, which is on my channel. So what, please repost this whole video so I can watch it tomorrow. Yeah, I'm going to leave this video up. What influenced your journey? All kinds of things, I guess. My father was kind of a South Park style, all sides dumb political cynic. He's kind of more of a reactionary Trump type person now, something between the Clinton era and Obama era kind of pushed him in that direction. That's kind of a long story. My mother and grandmother were union workers, and so I kind of have that sort of thing in my past. Growing up and getting into punk music and stuff during the Bush years, I think radicalized me quite a bit. And then the big push after becoming kind of, I was basically a Bernie bro, or, you know, a Nader, Ralph Nader supporter during the Bush years. And then watching how the Occupy movement went down was essentially what pushed me that little bit further, and working minimum wage jobs, of course. Also, I credit a lot of my ideas about the world through working fast food and grocery stores and department stores and stuff. Where do you get these videos? So I went through a phase from essentially the Bush years, I guess. I'd first listened to, so I was getting into punk music, and Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys has all his spoken word albums, so I started listening to those like crazy. The band Choking Victim would put little clips from Michael Parenti lectures in some of their songs, and I thought, wow, this is really cool. I wonder if I can find this. So, you go and you Google who's this person in the Choking Victim songs, comes up with the name Michael Parenti. I go to, whatever was my preferred music downloading service at the time. This is maybe like, I don't know, 2007 or so. And I am finding like William Blum and Ward Churchill and Derek Jensen and Angela Davis, Naomi Klein, all these people. And so then I'm downloading these lectures, and that's how I found it. Unless you're asking how you can find these videos, in which case right now they are set to private, but after this video is done, I will make them public. Radical Reviewer Building 7. I don't know too much about what Mike Rupert was saying about how the timeline is suspicious. That's about as close as I get into like the nitty gritty of the event itself. I don't think that it was wholly planned or anything by the Bush administration or anything like that. I just think that they were perhaps kind of waiting for something like that to take place and didn't do the necessary steps to stop it for whatever reason. And then after it did take place, they certainly went out of their way to use that event to engage in the policies that they wanted to engage in. Organizing into anarchy and... Am I feeling the burn? Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I will listen to You Are We. That kind of, for whatever reason, reminds me of the indigenous Mexican slogan, "You are my other me," which is like... the way that I treat you and stuff, I likewise treat myself. Cool. Thanks for watching, everyone. 9/11 was an inside joke, as the title of this video is obviously a reference to the Starfucking Hipster song of the same name, which I would recommend. 9/11 was an inside joke. Also, there's a Starfucking Hipster song, 9/11 to Infinity, which features Boots Riley of The Coup and of Sorry to Bother You fame, so you might want to look into that. That's pretty cool. I would also recommend Terrorist ? By Low Key. That is also very cool and would recommend. With all that, I thank you folks for watching. It's been a grueling 3 hours, but I think that maybe we've sort of learned a lot about things. Okay. Oh, 3 hours. All right. I appreciate you all for watching. You folks have a good one. Post-Scarcity Anarchism review comes out Friday. I hope to see you there for the premiere of that. That is, I'm quite excited for. Please, do the regular things, like the video and stuff. I don't really like saying that stuff. If you notice, I almost never say it in the videos, but Patreon, yada yada. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you folks next time. Bye.